There's a stillness here if you let yourself notice it. A place where the body can rest without fighting, where breath moves without instruction. This is the sleepy biologist. And if you're here now, settling into quiet, then you've already begun. Thank you for choosing this moment. To the members of this channel, your support makes these long nights possible, and I'm grateful for it. If this video brings you calm, a like or subscription helps others find it too. Super thanks and memberships are always appreciated, never expected. And if you'd like, leave a comment about where you're listening from tonight. It's good to know you're there. Now, let the world become smaller. Let your attention turn inward, where something ancient is always happening. Your bones are holding you right now. They've been doing this since before you could remember, since before memory itself. Every moment you've spent upright, every step across a room, every time you've stood from a chair, your skeleton has been in conversation with the ground beneath you. Not a loud conversation, not one you'd notice, just pressure, just weight, just the constant press of gravity asking your bones to respond and your bones answering. But what happens when that conversation stops? Not because the bones fail, not because something breaks, but because the ground, the pull, the weight, the resistance simply isn't there anymore. This is what happens when the body leaves gravity behind. It doesn't feel like much at first. Astronauts describe it as lightness, as floating, as freedom, and in a way it is. The body no longer has to work against the pull downward. Muscles relax, the spine lengthens slightly. There's a sense of ease that wasn't there before, but underneath that ease something else is beginning. Your bones are made of living tissue, not static, not fixed, but constantly remodeling. Inside them, two types of cells are always at work. Osteoblasts build bone, osteoclasts break it down. In a healthy body under normal gravity, these two are in balance. New bone is formed where stress demands it. Old bone is resorbed where it's no longer needed. The skeleton is always changing, always adapting to the forces placed upon it. And gravity has always been the primary force. Every time you walk, your bones experience tiny compressions. Every time you stand, your skeleton bears the weight of your body. These stresses are signals. They tell the osteoblasts where to build, where to reinforce, where strength is needed. The bones respond by becoming denser, stronger, more capable of handling the load. But in weightlessness, the signals stop. The osteoblasts slow down. There's no compression to respond to, no mechanical stress to measure. The body doesn't sense the need to maintain bone density because the conditions that required it are no longer present. Meanwhile, the osteoclasts keep working. They continue to break down bone, not because something is wrong, but because that's what they do. Bone remodeling never stops. The result is gradual, quiet. Bone density begins to decrease by about 1% per month. Calcium leaches from the skeleton into the bloodstream. The body is dismantling what it no longer perceives as necessary. This isn't damage, it's adaptation. The body is doing what it has always done, responding to its environment, conserving resources, adjusting to new conditions, but the adjustment comes at a cost. The bones become lighter, more fragile, less capable of handling sudden impacts or loads, and it happens whether you notice it or not. The femur, the long bone in your thigh, is one of the strongest bones in the body. It has to be. It bears the full weight of your upper body every time you stand. Its structure is remarkable, dense on the outside, spongy on the inside. With trabecular struts arranged precisely along lines of stress. It's a feat of biological engineering shaped by millions of years of evolution in a gravitational field. But in space, the femur begins to thin. The trabecular bone inside becomes less dense. The outer cortical bone weakens. The structure remains, but the strength diminishes. The spine is affected too. The vertebrae, those stacked bones that protect your spinal cord and support your torso, begin to lose density. The discs between them, no longer compressed by gravity, expand slightly. Astronauts grow taller in space, sometimes by as much as 2 inches, but it's not growth, it's the absence of compression. The spine stretches into a shape it was never meant to hold for long. Your ribs, your pelvis, your wrists, all of them respond the same way. The bones that bear the most weight on Earth lose density the fastest. The body is solving a problem that only exists because the old rules no longer apply. And the bones aren't the only ones listening. Inside your bone marrow, stem cells are producing red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. This process continues in weightlessness, but the signals guiding it begin to shift. The body detects changes in fluid distribution, in oxygen levels, in mechanical feedback. Some of these changes affect how blood cells are produced and how long they survive. The skeleton isn't just structure, it's also a reservoir. Calcium stored in bone is released when needed elsewhere in the body, for muscle contraction, for nerve signaling, for countless cellular processes. But when bone breaks down faster than it rebuilds, calcium floods into the blood. The kidneys have to filter it out. The risk of kidney stones increases. The body is dealing with an excess it never asked for. None of this happens loudly. There's no pain, no sudden collapse, just a slow, steady shift in what the body considers normal. And if gravity returns, the body begins the long process of rebuilding. Bone density can recover, but it takes time, months, sometimes years. The skeleton has to relearn what it once knew instinctively, how to bear weight, how to respond to stress, how to maintain strength against a force that never stops pulling downward. But for now, in this moment, imagine a body without that pull, a skeleton that no longer feels the ground, bones that have spent a lifetime in conversation with gravity, suddenly finding themselves in silence. They don't break, they don't fail. They simply begin to let go, and the bones are not alone in this. Other systems, other tissues, other parts of you that have always relied on weight, they're listening too, adjusting, recalibrating in ways you'll begin to feel. There's something happening right now inside you. Your blood is moving, not in the way you'd imagine if you tried to picture it, not rushing or flowing like a river, just moving, cell by cell, through vessels so small you'd need a microscope to see them, through arteries thick enough to feel if you pressed your fingers to your wrist. It's been moving your entire life, and it's always known which way was down, not because blood is smart, not because it has awareness, but because gravity has always been there, pulling. Every drop of fluid in your body has spent every moment of your existence feeling that pull, responding to it, being shaped by it. Your heart beats, the blood moves outward, it travels through arteries, then smaller arterioles, then capillaries so thin that red blood cells have to squeeze through single file, and then it returns, through venules, through veins, back toward the heart. But here's the thing, arteries have thick walls, they're muscular, they can push blood forward with the force of each heartbeat. The blood doesn't have a choice, it moves because it's propelled. Veins are different, their walls are thinner, less muscular, they can't push the same way, so the blood in your veins moves more slowly, it drifts, and in your legs, in your lower body, it has to move upward. Against gravity, this is where the valves come in. Tiny flaps inside your veins, one-way doors. They open when blood flows upward. They close when blood tries to fall back down. You've never seen them. You've never felt them. but they've been working every second since you were born. When you walk, your leg muscles squeeze the veins, the blood is pushed upward, the valves open. When the muscles relax, the valves close. The blood can't fall back down. Step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, the blood returns. But now imagine this: no gravity, no pull downward. The blood doesn't pool in your legs anymore. There's no down for it to settle into, so it drifts everywhere equally. At first, this feels like nothing. Maybe a slight fullness in your head, a mild pressure behind your eyes. Your face might look a little rounder. Not much, just enough that someone who knows you well might notice. Your legs, though, they begin to thin. The fluid that usually pools there, blood, lymph, interstitial fluid, starts moving upward. Your calves lose their usual slight puffiness. Your ankles look sharper. The veins that were always visible under your skin become less prominent. It's not dramatic, but it's real, and your body notices. There are sensors in your blood vessels, baroreceptors. They measure pressure. They've been calibrated by a lifetime of gravity. They know what normal pressure feels like in your legs, in your abdomen, in your neck, in your head. But now the pressure is changing, more fluid in the upper body, less in the lower body. The baroreceptors send signals to the brain. Something's different. The body tries to adjust. Your heart rate might change slightly. Your blood vessels might constrict or dilate in ways they wouldn't normally. The body is trying to restore what it thinks is normal. But normal doesn't exist anymore. And after a while, the body stops trying to fight it. It recalibrates. This is the new normal now. Here's what's strange. You have about 5 liters of blood in your body. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. That blood is always distributed in a specific pattern. Roughly 70% in your veins, about 20% in your arteries, the rest in capillaries and smaller vessels. But within that distribution there's variation. When you stand, more blood is in your legs. When you lie down, it redistributes. Your body is used to this. It happens every time you change position. The baroreceptors adjust, the heart compensates, blood pressure stays stable. But in weightlessness, there's no positional change. There's no standing or lying down. There's just floating, and the blood redistributes in a way it never has before. More fluid moves toward the chest, toward the head. The heart detects this. It senses that there's more blood returning to it than usual, more volume in the central circulation, and the heart makes a decision. If there's too much blood, the body doesn't need all of it, so it starts getting rid of some. Not immediately, not all at once, but over days, over weeks, your blood volume decreases. You lose about 10 to 15% of your total blood volume. The body is adjusting to what it perceives as excess. Red blood cells are broken down. The spleen works overtime. Plasma is filtered by the kidneys and excreted as urine. You're not bleeding. You're not losing blood in any dangerous way. You're just carrying less of it, because the body has decided you don't need as much. And maybe in weightlessness you don't. But when gravity returns, if it returns, the body has to rebuild what it lost. And that takes time. There's something else. Your blood vessels, they are not passive tubes, they're active, alive. They respond to signals. They constrict when they need to raise blood pressure. They dilate when they need to lower it. And they've been doing this in response to gravity for your entire life. When you stand up quickly, blood rushes toward your legs. Your blood pressure drops in your head. You might feel dizzy for a moment. But then the vessels in your legs constrict. The heart beats faster. Blood is redirected upward. Your blood pressure stabilizes. This happens automatically. You don't think about it. You don't have to. But in weightlessness, the vessels start losing their training. They don't need to constrict as much. They don't need to respond as quickly. The constant adjustments they've been making for years. Every time you stood, sat, lay down, those adjustments are no longer necessary, so the vessels become less responsive. The smooth muscle in their walls weakens slightly, and when gravity returns, they don't respond the way they used to. Astronauts returning to Earth often experience orthostatic intolerance. When they stand, their blood pressure drops. The vessels don't constrict fast enough. Blood pools in their legs. They feel dizzy, lightheaded. Sometimes they faint. It's not permanent. The body relearns, but it takes time, and during that time, standing becomes difficult. Something you never had to think about becomes something you have to work at. All because the fluid in your body forgot which way was down, and had to remember again. Your bones feel like solid things, but they're not solid at all, not in the way stone is solid, not in the way metal holds its shape unchanging. Bone is alive, constantly sensing, constantly responding, constantly making small decisions about its own structure based on information it gathers from the world pressing against it. There are cells embedded deep within the mineral matrix of your skeleton that exist solely to measure force, and these cells have been listening to your every movement since long before you were aware you could move at all. They're called osteocytes, and they live in tiny chambers called lacunae, scattered throughout the dense material of bone like stars in a solid sky, each one connected to its neighbours through delicate threads of cytoplasm that reach through microscopic channels in the bone tissue, forming a vast sensing network that extends throughout your entire skeleton. When you walk, your bones bend. Not visibly, not in any way you could see with your eyes, but they bend nonetheless, flexing microscopically under the load of your body weight, compressing slightly with each step, stretching slightly when you shift your weight, deforming in ways so small they're measured in micrometers, in thousandths of a millimeter. These deformations create fluid flow through the tiny channels where the osteocytes live, and the osteocytes can feel this flow the way you might feel wind against your skin. The fluid moves past their cell membranes, past the delicate projections they extend into the channels, and this movement, this mechanical stimulus, triggers something inside them. Ion channels open in their membranes, allowing calcium to rush into the cell, and this influx of calcium sets off a cascade of internal signals that travels to the nucleus, where genes are activated, where decisions are made about what the bone should do next. If the force is strong, if the deformation is significant, the osteocytes send signals to osteoblasts, the cells that build bone. They release small proteins, signaling molecules that drift through the bone tissue and tell the osteoblasts to come here, to this location, to lay down new mineral, to reinforce this area, because the stress is high and the bone needs to be stronger. This is how bone adapts to exercise, how it responds to the repeated impacts of running, how it becomes denser in the places where you need it most. The bone is listening to the forces you place upon it and shaping itself accordingly, building strength where strength is required, adding material where the load demands it. But there's another side to this system, and it's just as important as the building. If the force decreases, if the deformation lessens, if the mechanical signals grow quiet, the osteocytes change their message. They begin producing proteins that signal osteoclasts, the cells that break down bone, to come and remove material that's no longer needed. This isn't destruction, this is maintenance. Bone is metabolically expensive to maintain, and the body doesn't waste resources keeping bone density high in places where the load doesn't justify it. So when the forces decrease, the bone thins, resorbing material that is no longer serving a purpose, freeing up calcium and other minerals for use elsewhere in the body. This system has been running your entire life, balancing building and breakdown, responding to every step, every jump, every moment of standing or sitting or lying down. constantly adjusting the architecture of your skeleton to match the mechanical demands placed upon it. And it has always assumed one thing, that gravity will be there, providing a baseline load, a constant force that never stops pressing downward. The osteocytes have been calibrated by this assumption. They've been shaped by millions of years of evolution in a gravitational field, and their sensitivity to mechanical strain has been tuned to operate within a range that assumes the body will always be bearing its own weight. But when that weight disappears, when the body enters an environment where gravity no longer pulls, the mechanical signals change in a way the osteocytes have never encountered before. The bones stop bending under load. The fluid flow through the lacuna canalicular network slows to almost nothing. The deformations that used to happen with every step, with every movement, simply don't occur anymore. And the osteocytes, sensing this absence, interpret it the only way they know how, as a signal that the bone is no longer needed at its current density. They stop sending signals to the osteoblasts. The construction slows, the reinforcement stops. Meanwhile, the osteoclasts continue their work breaking down bone as they always have, removing material in the normal cycle of remodeling that never ceases. The balance tips. More bone is removed than is replaced. Density decreases, not because of disease, not because of deficiency, but because the mechanical feedback loop that has been maintaining the skeleton has been interrupted at its most fundamental level. The osteocytes don't know they're in space. They don't understand that the absence of force is temporary, that gravity still exists, that the body might return to it someday. They only know what they can sense, and what they sense is silence, a lack of mechanical stimulation that suggests the bone is no longer bearing loads, that strength is no longer required, that resources would be better spent elsewhere. So they do what they're programmed to do. They signal for resorption. They allow the bone to thin, and the process is gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but continuous. Every day without mechanical load, every day without the deformations that signal the need for strength, the balance shifts a little further. Calcium leaches into the bloodstream at a rate slightly faster than it's deposited back into the bone. The mineral density decreases by small fractions of a percent, changes so subtle they wouldn't show on a scan taken day to day, but measurable over weeks, undeniable over months. The osteocytes themselves begin to change too. In the absence of mechanical stimulation, some of them undergo apoptosis, programmed cell death. They are not damaged. They're not diseased. They simply receive signals that they're no longer needed, that the network of sensors within the bone can afford to lose a few nodes. The lacunae they once occupied remain empty now, tiny voids in the bone matrix where a living cell once listened for the world's pressure. The network of sensing becomes less dense, less responsive, less capable of detecting the forces that might return someday. This is not irreversible, but it's not easily undone either. When mechanical load returns, when the bones begin to bear weight again, the osteocytes that remain can sense the change. They can feel the fluid flow resuming, the deformations returning, the pressure coming back. They begin sending signals to rebuild, to recruit osteoblasts, to lay down new bone mineral in the areas where stress has returned. But rebuilding takes longer than breakdown. Bone formation is a slow process, requiring the careful deposition of collagen matrix, the gradual mineralization of that matrix with calcium and phosphate, the organization of crystals into a structure that can bear load. The osteoblasts work at their own pace, and while they can restore what was lost, they need time, months, sometimes years, to return the bone to its previous density. And some osteocytes that were lost don't come back. The network can rebuild, new cells can differentiate and take up residence in the bone, but the process is incomplete. The skeleton that returns to gravity is not quite the same skeleton that left it. It carries a memory of the absence, a structural echo of the time spent without force, a quiet record written in the density of its minerals and the population of its sensing cells. The osteocytes don't remember in the way you remember. They don't hold on to the past as experience. But the bone itself holds a history, written in its architecture, in the thickness of its trabeculae, in the density of its cortex. And that history can be read, measured, quantified by those who know how to look. For now, though, in this moment of absence, the osteocytes are simply quiet. They extend their delicate processes through the canaliculi, waiting for signals that don't come, listening for forces that have disappeared. They continue their basic metabolism, maintaining themselves, staying alive in their small chambers of bone. But the conversation they've been having with the world, the constant exchange of mechanical information that has guided the skeleton's shape, has paused. And in that pause, the bone begins its slow drift towards something lighter, something less dense, something shaped by stillness rather than by the constant pull that once defined it. Think of the heart as a pump that has been working against resistance for your entire life. Not the resistance of clogged arteries or damaged valves, but the simple resistance of gravity itself. Every time your heart contracts, it pushes blood upward through your body, lifting it against the constant downward pull that exists everywhere on Earth. This work is invisible. You never feel it happening, but it requires energy and it requires strength, and the heart has built itself to meet that demand. The left ventricle is the strongest chamber of your heart. It has to be. This is the chamber that receives oxygenated blood from the lungs and pumps it out through the aorta to the rest of your body. When you're standing, the blood in your legs is roughly 4 feet below your heart. To push blood down to your feet and back up again requires pressure. The left ventricle generates that pressure with each contraction, squeezing hard enough to send blood through thousands of miles of vessels, maintaining enough force to overcome gravity's pull on every drop of fluid in your circulatory system. The muscle walls of the left ventricle are thick because they need to be. Cardiac muscle cells are layered in spirals, allowing the chamber to twist as it contracts, wringing out blood with each beat. The thickness of these walls is proportional to the work they perform. More work means more muscle means more strength. And for your entire life, the work has included fighting gravity. But what happens when that fight ends? In weightlessness, the heart still beats, blood still circulates, oxygen still reaches your tissues, nothing stops working. But the amount of effort required changes. The heart no longer needs to generate as much pressure to move blood through the body. There is no column of blood in the legs that needs to be lifted. There's no gravitational gradient to overcome. The resistance drops, and the heart notices. Cardiac muscle responds to workload the same way skeletal muscle does. When demand is high, the muscle grows stronger. When demand decreases, the muscle adapts by reducing its mass. This isn't atrophy in the sense of disease or weakness. This is optimization. The body doesn't maintain tissue that isn't needed. Muscle is metabolically expensive. It requires energy to sustain. If the workload decreases, the body conserves resources by reducing the amount of muscle it maintains. In the first few weeks of weightlessness, the changes are subtle. The heart continues beating at roughly the same rate. Blood pressure remains relatively stable, though the distribution of that pressure shifts as fluid redistributes upward. But inside the cardiac muscle cells, changes are already beginning. Gene expression shifts. Proteins that support muscle growth are produced less frequently. Proteins involved in breaking down muscle tissue increase. The left ventricle begins to thin, not dramatically, not quickly, but measurably. Studies of astronauts who spend months in space show that the walls of the left ventricle can lose up to 10% of their mass. The chamber itself may become slightly smaller. The muscle fibers that spiral around it become less dense. The heart is remodeling itself to match the reduced workload, shedding mass it no longer needs to maintain. This process happens without symptoms. There's no chest pain, no shortness of breath, no sign that anything is wrong. The heart continues to function perfectly well for the demands placed on it in a weightless environment. It's still strong enough to circulate blood. It's still capable of increasing its rate during exercise or stress. It's just smaller, less muscular, less capable of generating the high pressures it once could. And this would be fine if the body never returned to gravity, but if it does, when it does, the heart has to relearn how to work against resistance. When an astronaut returns to Earth, their heart suddenly has to pump blood upward again. It has to generate pressures it hasn't needed to generate in months. The left ventricle, now thinner and weaker than it was, has to handle a workload it's no longer fully adapted for. This is why astronauts returning from long-duration spaceflight often experience orthostatic intolerance. When they stand, their heart struggles to maintain adequate blood pressure in the upper body. Blood pools in the legs. The brain receives less blood flow. Dizziness occurs, sometimes fainting. Not because the heart is damaged, but because it's temporarily underprepared for the mechanical demands of standing in a gravitational field. The heart can rebuild. It can regain the muscle mass it lost. But this takes time, just as it takes time to build strength in any muscle. The cardiac cells have to increase protein synthesis again. The muscle fibers have to thicken. The walls of the left ventricle have to return to their previous dimensions. And during this rebuilding period, the heart is working harder than it's accustomed to, struggling slightly with a task that used to be automatic. There's another change that happens, more subtle than muscle mass, but equally important. The heart's rhythm is regulated by electrical signals. These signals originate in the sinoatrial node, a small cluster of specialized cells in the right atrium that acts as the heart's natural pacemaker. The sinoatrial node generates impulses that spread through the heart muscle, causing the chambers to contract in coordinated sequence. The rate at which the sinoatrial node fires is influenced by many factors. The autonomic nervous system can speed it up or slow it down. Hormones can affect it, and mechanical stretch can influence it too. When the heart chambers fill with blood, the walls stretch slightly, and this stretch provides feedback that helps regulate heart rate. In weightlessness, the amount of stretch changes, with fluid redistributing toward the chest. The heart may receive more blood returning from the upper body and less from the lower body. The stretch patterns change. The feedback the sinoatrial node receives is different. Over time, this can alter the baseline heart rate and the heart rate variability, the natural fluctuation in time between heartbeats that reflects the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activity. Some astronauts experience a slight decrease in resting heart rate in space. Others show changes in heart rate variability patterns. These changes aren't dangerous, but they reflect the heart's adaptation to a new set of mechanical conditions. The pacemaker cells are recalibrating based on the information they're receiving about blood flow and chamber filling. And when gravity returns, the pacemaker has to recalibrate again. It has to adjust to the old patterns of blood return, to the old stretch signals, to the old demands on cardiac output. This usually happens smoothly, but not always instantly. There can be a period of adjustment where heart rate responses are slightly off, where the coordination between heart rate and blood pressure isn't quite what it used to be. The heart also relies on adequate blood flow to its own muscle tissue. The coronary arteries branch off from the aorta and supply oxygenated blood to the cardiac muscle itself. In weightlessness, with reduced cardiac workload, the demand for coronary blood flow decreases slightly. The The heart muscle doesn't need as much oxygen because it's not working as hard. The coronary arteries may become slightly less responsive to signals that would normally cause them to dilate during increased demand. This is another adaptation that needs to reverse when gravitational load returns. The coronary circulation has to ramp back up to support the increased work the heart is doing. Usually this happens without issue, but in some cases, particularly if the period of weightlessness has been very long, there can be a temporary mismatch between cardiac demand and coronary supply during the readaptation period. None of these changes are permanent damage. The heart is remarkably adaptable. It can lose mass and regain it. It can adjust its rhythm and readjust it. It can reduce its strength and rebuild it. But the process takes time, and during the transitions, both into weightlessness and back out of it, the heart is working through a period where its structure and function don't quite match the environment it's in. Your heart is beating right now. It's been beating without pause since early in your development, long before you were born. It will continue beating, adapting to whatever conditions it encounters, optimizing its structure to match the demands placed on it. It's a muscle like any other in that way, responding to use and disuse, growing stronger when challenged, becoming more efficient when the challenge lessens. And if the challenge is gravity itself, if the constant resistance that has shaped every beat of your heart suddenly disappears, the heart will notice. It will adapt. It will become what it needs to be for the environment it finds itself in. Even if that means becoming smaller, even if that means letting go of strength it spent a lifetime building. The heart doesn't hold on to the past. It only responds to the present, beat by beat, always working, always adjusting, always pumping blood through a body that continues to need it, whether that body is standing on the ground or floating in the absence of pull. There are 3 semicircular canals in each inner ear, arranged at right angles to one another like the corners of a room. They've been there since you were small, developing in the darkness before birth, filling with fluid, preparing for a world they hadn't yet encountered. Each canal detects rotation in a different plane. One senses you turning your head left or right. Another senses you tilting forward or back. The third detects the roll of your head to either shoulder. Inside each canal, there's a structure called the cupula, a gelatinous membrane that sits across the fluid like a door left slightly ajar. When your head rotates, the fluid in the canal moves, bending the cupula, and this bending triggers hair cells embedded in its base. These hair cells convert mechanical movement into electrical signals. The signals travel along the vestibular nerve to your brain, which interprets them as rotation. You've never thought about this process. It happens below consciousness, a quiet conversation between fluid and membrane, between hair cell and nerve fiber, between inner ear and brain. But it's been running every moment you've been awake, tracking every turn of your head, every change in orientation. Then there are the otolith organs, 2 of them in each ear, the ventricle and the sacral. They don't detect rotation, they detect linear acceleration and the pull of gravity. Inside each organ is a patch of hair cells covered by a membrane embedded with tiny calcium carbonate crystals called otoconia. These crystals are denser than the surrounding fluid. When your head tilts, when you accelerate forward, when gravity pulls downward, the crystals shift slightly. This shift bends the hair cells beneath them. The hair cells send signals. The brain interprets the position of your head relative to gravity. This system has been your reference point for up and down since infancy. It's how you learn to sit upright, how you learn to walk without falling, how you navigate stairs without looking at your feet, how you know, even with your eyes closed, whether you're lying on your back or standing on your side. But the system was built for one assumption. Gravity would always be there. In weightlessness, The otoconia still exist. The hair cells still function. The vestibular nerve still carries signals. But the information changes. The crystals no longer settle in one direction. They float, suspended in the fluid, pressing against the hair cells in ways that don't correspond to any position the brain recognizes. The ventricle, which normally detects horizontal acceleration and head tilt, suddenly receives signals that suggest the head is tilting in multiple directions at once. The saccule, which detects vertical movement and gravity's pull, receives signals that no longer make sense in the context of up and down. The brain tries to interpret this flood of conflicting information, and it can't. The result for many people is space motion sickness. Not everyone experiences it. Some adapt within hours, others suffer for days. The symptoms are familiar: nausea, disorientation, sometimes vomiting. But the cause isn't an infection or toxin, it's a sensory mismatch. The vestibular system is reporting one thing, the eyes are reporting another. The proprioceptors in the muscles and joints are offering a third perspective, and none of them agree. On Earth, when you move your head, all three systems provide consistent information. Your inner ear detects the rotation. Your eyes see the world shift. Your neck muscles feel the change in position. Everything aligns. The brain integrates these signals and constructs a stable sense of orientation. But in weightlessness, the alignment breaks. You turn your head, and the semicircular canals detect the rotation correctly. But the otolith organs, confused by the absence of gravitational pull, send signals that don't match. Your eyes see the cabin around you, but there's no clear floor or ceiling, no visual cue for which way is down. Your proprioceptors detect muscle tension and joint position, but without the constant load of gravity, those signals are different too. The brain tries to reconcile this. It expects consistency. When it doesn't find it, the response is often nausea. The same response it might trigger if you were poisoned, if something in your system needed to be expelled. It's a misapplied defense mechanism, treating sensory conflict as if it were contamination. Some people adapt quickly. Within days, their brain stops trying to interpret vestibular signals in terms of gravity. It builds a new framework for orientation, one based on visual cues and a remembered position rather than on the pull of the earth. The nausea fades. Movement becomes easier. They learn to navigate in 3 dimensions without needing to know which way is down. Others don't adapt as easily. The sensory conflict persists. Every movement triggers disorientation. Some astronauts spend weeks feeling vaguely nauseated, never quite comfortable, never quite able to trust their sense of position in space. And then there are the otoconia themselves, those tiny crystals that have been sitting on the hair cells your entire life, held in place by gravity, pressing downward in a way that told your brain where the ground was. In weightlessness, they begin to shift. Not immediately, not all at once, but over weeks, over months, some of them detach from the membrane. They drift into the fluid of the inner ear, no longer anchored, no longer serving their function. This can happen on Earth too, particularly as people age. It's called benign paroxysmal positional vertigo. The loose crystals float into the semicircular canals where they don't belong. When the head moves, the crystals shift, creating false signals of rotation. The person feels like the room is spinning. It's intensely disorienting, though not dangerous. In space, the same thing can happen, but for different reasons. The crystals aren't dislodged by age or injury. They're dislodged by the absence of the force that kept them in place. And when they drift, they can create the same false sensations. Sudden feelings of spinning, of tumbling, even when the body is still. Some astronauts report strange sensory experiences months into their missions. A sudden lurch of vertigo when turning their head. A feeling that the room is rotating when nothing is moving. These aren't hallucinations, they are the result of otoconia that have come loose, sending signals that no longer correspond to reality. The semicircular canals continue to function, mostly unchanged. Rotation is rotation, whether gravity is present or not. The fluid still moves when the head turns. The cupula still bends. The hair cells still fire. But even here there are subtle differences. On Earth, the fluid in this canal settles slightly when the head is still, affected by gravity's pull. In weightlessness, the fluid remains in constant slight motion, never fully settling. This can create low-level background noise in the vestibular signals, a kind of static that the brain has to learn to ignore. And all of this, the confused otoliths, the drifting crystals, the persistent sensory mismatch, affects more than just balance. It affects spatial memory. The hippocampus, the brain region involved in forming memories of places and navigation, relies heavily on vestibular input. When that input becomes unreliable, spatial memory can become less accurate. Some astronauts report difficulty remembering where objects are stored on the station. They reach for something in a location they remember, only to find it's not there. Not because the object moved, but because their memory of its location is less precise than it used to be. There's also evidence that vestibular dysfunction affects cognitive load. The brain is working harder to make sense of the conflicting signals, to maintain a sense of orientation without the usual cues. This takes processing power. It uses resources that might otherwise be available for other tasks. Some astronauts report feeling mentally slower in the first weeks of weightlessness, not because their intelligence has decreased, but because their brain is occupied with the constant effort of reorienting itself. Over time, most people compensate. The brain is plastic. It can rewire. It can learn to ignore signals that aren't useful and pay attention to new cues. Visual references become more important. Tactile contact with surfaces helps establish orientation. The memory of which direction you were facing moments ago becomes a guide for where you are now. But the compensation isn't perfect. Even astronauts who spend months in space, who seem completely adapted to weightlessness, can still experience moments of disorientation. A sudden head movement in dim lighting, a glance out the window at Earth spinning below, a moment when all the usual cues disappear and the brain, just for a second, has no idea which way is up. Because the truth is, there is no up anymore. There's only the memory of up. The habit of thinking in terms of up and down, the deeply ingrained assumption that the world has a floor and a ceiling. And when that assumption is removed, when the inner ear tries to function without the constant is built around, what remains is adaptation. Imperfect, effortful, sometimes incomplete. But adaptation nonetheless. The body learning to navigate a space that has no ground. The brain constructing orientation from fragments, the inner ear, still filled with fluid and crystals and hair cells, still sending signals, still trying to tell you where you are, even when the answer is nowhere the system was designed to recognize. Your calves are tense right now, even if you can't feel it, even if you think you're completely relaxed, even if you're lying down in the softest position you can find. They're not rigid, not clenched, just holding a baseline level of tension that keeps them ready, keeps them responsive, keeps them prepared for the possibility that you might need to stand at any moment. This tension has been there your entire life, a quiet hum of muscle fiber activation that never fully stops, and it exists because gravity never stops asking your body to resist it. Every muscle in your body that opposes gravity, your calves, your thighs, your glutes, the long muscles along your spine, the deep stabilizers in your core, these are called anti-gravity muscles, and they've been working since you first learned to hold your head up as an infant, since you first sat without support, since you first pulled yourself to standing and felt the full weight of your body pressing down through your legs into the ground. They've been active ever since, even when you're sitting, even when you're resting, maintaining just enough contraction to keep your posture upright, to keep your skeleton aligned, to prevent you from folding under your own weight. When you stand still, your calves are constantly making small adjustments, tiny contractions that shift your center of mass forward and back, keeping you balanced over your feet without you having to think about it. When you sit, your back muscles are engaged to hold your torso vertical, to keep your spine from slumping forward. When you walk, your glutes and thighs are not only propelling you forward, but also preventing your body from collapsing with each step, absorbing the impact, controlling the descent of your weight as your foot strikes the ground. This is work, constant, invisible work. And the muscles have built themselves to meet this demand. Muscle fibers grow in response to load, to resistance, to the repeated stress of contracting against a force that pushes back. When you exercise, you're deliberately creating this stress, asking your muscles to work harder than usual so they'll adapt by becoming stronger. But even without deliberate exercise, your muscles are under constant low-level stress simply from living in a gravitational field, simply from holding your body upright, simply from moving through space that resists you. The muscle fibers themselves are composed of proteins, actin and myosin, arranged in overlapping filaments that slide past each other when the muscle contracts. The more these proteins are used, the more the muscle cells produce them, building up the contractile machinery inside each fiber, thickening the fibers themselves, increasing the overall mass and strength of the muscle. But protein synthesis requires energy, requires resources, requires signals from the body that the muscle is needed at its current size and strength. And those signals come primarily from mechanical load, from the tension generated when the muscle contracts against resistance. In weightlessness, the load disappears. Not entirely. You can still move, you can still push off surfaces, still reach for objects, still rotate your body in space, but the constant baseline tension, the continuous effort to hold yourself upright, the repetitive stress of standing and walking and supporting your own weight, all of that vanishes. Your calves, which have been contracting rhythmically with every step you've taken, every day of your life, suddenly have almost nothing to do. Your back muscles, which have been holding your spine erect against the pull downward, no longer feel that pull. Your thighs, your glutes, your core, all of them experience a dramatic reduction in the work they're required to perform. And the body notices this reduction immediately at the cellular level, in ways that don't produce any sensation at first, but begin changing the muscle within hours. Inside each muscle cell, there are sensors that detect mechanical tension, that measure how hard the fiber is working, how much force it's generating. When these sensors detect high tension, they activate signaling pathways that lead to the nucleus of the cell, where genes are turned on that code for muscle proteins, that increase protein synthesis, that promote muscle growth and maintenance. When the sensors detect low tension, when the work decreases, those pathways quiet down, and other pathways activate instead, pathways that promote protein breakdown, that tag muscle proteins for degradation, that begin dismantling the contractile machinery inside the fiber. This happens constantly, even on Earth. Your muscles are always balancing protein synthesis and protein breakdown, building and degrading simultaneously, and your overall muscle mass stays stable when these two processes are in equilibrium. But when mechanical load decreases, the balance shifts, breakdown accelerates, synthesis slows, and the muscle begins to shrink. In the first week of weightlessness, the changes are minimal, hardly measurable. The muscle fibers are still intact, still capable of generating force, but inside the cells, protein degradation is already outpacing protein synthesis. Muscle mass begins to decline slowly at first, less than 1% per week in some muscles, slightly more in others, depending on how much they've been relieved of their usual workload. The muscles most affected are the ones that were working hardest against gravity, the calves, the soleus muscle in particular, which is active almost constantly when you're standing or walking, maintaining tension to keep you from toppling forward. The quadriceps in the thighs, the gluteus maximus, the erector spinae muscles along the spine. All of these begin to lose mass within the first few weeks, and the loss continues, week after week, month after month. If no countermeasures are taken, if the astronaut doesn't exercise deliberately to create artificial load, the muscles can lose 20 to 30% of their mass over the course of several months. The fibers become thinner, the muscle tissue becomes less dense, the strength decreases proportionally. This isn't painful. There's no soreness, no injury, no inflammation. The muscles are simply adapting to a new environment, shedding mass they no longer need to maintain, conserving resources that would otherwise be spent on upkeep for tissue that isn't being used. It's efficient in a way, this response. The body is being practical, but the consequences reveal themselves later when gravity returns, when the body suddenly needs those muscles again and finds them unprepared. There's another layer to this. Muscle isn't just about size and strength. It's also about coordination, about the nervous system's ability to recruit muscle fibers in the right sequence, at the right intensity, to produce smooth and controlled movement. This ability is called neuromuscular control, and it's maintained through constant practice, through the repetitive use of muscles in familiar patterns. When you walk, you're not consciously controlling each muscle contraction. Your nervous system has learned the pattern, has stored it as a motor program that runs automatically, coordinating the firing of hundreds of muscle fibers across dozens of muscles to produce a fluid gait. This motor program was learned through years of practice, through millions of steps taken since childhood, and it's maintained by continuing to use it. In weightlessness, you stop walking, you stop standing. The motor programs for these actions are no longer being used, and over time they begin to fade, not completely, but enough that when you return to gravity, your gait feels strange, your balance feels off, your movements feel less automatic than they used to be. Astronauts returning from long missions sometimes describe feeling clumsy, feeling like they've forgotten how to walk, like they have to think about movements that used to be effortless. It's not that they've lost the knowledge intellectually, they still understand what walking is, but the motor program has degraded slightly, the coordination between muscles has become less precise, and the nervous system has to relearn the pattern through practice. The muscles also lose some of their mitochondrial density. Mitochondria are the organelles inside cells that produce energy, that convert glucose and oxygen into the ATP molecules that power muscle contraction. The number of mitochondria in a muscle fiber is proportional to how much energy that fiber needs to produce regularly. High-endurance activities, sustained contractions, continuous effort. These all promote mitochondrial biogenesis, the creation of new mitochondria. But in weightlessness, when the muscles are no longer sustaining continuous low-level contractions, when they're no longer working constantly to hold the body upright, the demand for energy decreases, and the muscle cells respond by reducing their mitochondrial content, by allowing some mitochondria to be broken down and recycled. The muscle becomes less capable of sustained aerobic work, less efficient at using oxygen to produce energy. This change is reversible, but like the loss of muscle mass, it takes time to undo. When the muscles begin working against gravity again, when sustained effort is required once more, the cells will gradually increase their mitochondrial density, rebuilding the capacity for endurance. But in the meantime, tasks that used to be easy, walking upstairs, standing for long periods, become more fatiguing than they were before. There are also changes in the muscle fibers themselves, in the types of fibers that make up each muscle. Muscle fibers come in different types, broadly categorized as slow twitch and fast twitch. Slow twitch fibers are built for endurance, for sustained contractions, for resisting fatigue. Fast twitch fibers are built for power, for rapid contractions, for generating force quickly. Most muscles contain a mix of both types, with the proportion depending on the muscle's function. Anti-gravity muscles, the ones that hold you upright, tend to have a higher proportion of slow twitch fibers because they need to contract continuously for long periods without tiring. But in weightlessness, when continuous contraction is no longer needed, some of the slow twitch fibers begin to convert toward a more fast twitch phenotype, changing their protein composition, altering their metabolic characteristics, becoming less suited for endurance and more suited for brief, powerful contractions that aren't really needed in a weightless environment either. This conversion is partial, incomplete, but measurable, and it means that when gravity returns, the muscles are not only smaller and weaker, but also less capable of the sustained effort they were originally designed for. All of this happens quietly, without warning, without discomfort. You could spend months in weightlessness and feel perfectly fine, moving easily through the cabin, performing tasks without difficulty, but your muscles would be changing beneath the surface, adapting to the absence of load, letting go of the structures they no longer need to maintain. And when you finally stood again on solid ground, when you felt your full weight pressing down through your legs for the first time in months, the muscles would struggle, they would tremble slightly under the load. They would remind you through fatigue and weakness just how much work they had been doing all along. Work you never noticed because it was constant, because it was always there, because the body had been carrying it without complaint since the day you first learned to stand. Your spine is made of 33 bones stacked on top of each other. Well, not exactly stacked. There's something between them. Discs, soft cushions. They sit between most of the vertebrae like padding between hard surfaces. Each disc has two parts. The outer ring is tough, fibrous. It's called the annulus fibrosus, which sounds formal, but really it's just layers of collagen wrapped around and around like a spiral. The inside is different, softer. It's called the nucleus pulposus, a gel-filled center, mostly water, some proteins, some proteoglycans that hold the water in place. This gel acts like a shock absorber. When you walk, the impact travels up through your legs into your spine. The discs compress slightly, they spread the force, they protect the vertebrae from grinding against each other. When you bend forward, the front of the disc compresses and the back expands. When you twist, the disc rotates slightly. When you lean to one side, the disc adjusts its shape to accommodate. They're quiet about this work. You don't feel them doing it, but they've been doing it constantly. And here's something you might not have noticed. You're taller in the morning than you are at night. Not by much, maybe half an inch, maybe a little more. This happens because of the discs. During the day, as you stand and sit and walk, gravity compresses them. Water is slowly squeezed out of the gel center into the surrounding tissues. The discs become slightly thinner. Your spine becomes slightly shorter. At night, when you lie down, the pressure is relieved. The discs rehydrate. They draw water back in. They expand. Your spine lengthens again. This cycle repeats every day. It's been repeating since you were young. Your body expects it. But in weightlessness, the cycle stops. The discs no longer compress during the day since there's no weight pressing down on them. They stay expanded, fully hydrated, slightly swollen even, and the spine begins to lengthen, not just at night, all the time. Astronauts grow taller in space, some by an inch, some by 2 inches, some even more. It's not bone growth, the vertebrae themselves don't change size, it's the discs. They're no longer being compressed, so they occupy more space than they usually do. This sounds harmless, maybe even pleasant. Who wouldn't want to be a little taller? But the spine wasn't designed to hold this length for extended periods. The ligaments that connect the vertebrae to each other, that stabilize the spine, that prevent excessive movement, they're calibrated for a certain distance between the bones. When that distance increases, the ligaments stretch. They become looser. The spine becomes less stable. Some astronauts report back pain, not severe, not debilitating, just a dull ache that develops over weeks. It's worse in some people than others. No one fully understands why. Part of it might be the ligaments stretching. Part of it might be the muscles around the spine trying to compensate for the increased length, for the reduced stability, for the sense that something isn't quite right. Part of it might be the discs themselves, swollen beyond their usual dimensions, pressing against structures they don't normally press against. The intervertebral discs have nerve endings in their outer layers. Not many, just enough to detect damage to signal when something is wrong. When the discs swell, when they push outward more than usual, those nerve endings might be stimulated in ways they're not accustomed to, and the signal they send is pain, mild, persistent, hard to locate precisely, the kind of pain that makes you want to stretch, to shift position, to find some way to relieve the pressure. But in weightlessness, there's no position that relieves it. There's no way to compress the discs back to their normal size because there's no weight to press them down. Some astronauts try exercises. They use resistance bands, bungee cords, devices that simulate load on the spine. This helps a little. It creates artificial compression. It reminds the discs what they're supposed to be doing. But it's not the same as gravity. Gravity is constant, unrelenting. It compresses the discs every moment you're upright, every day of your life. A few hours of exercise can't replicate that. So the discs remain expanded, and the spine remains longer, and the back pain for some remains too. There's another concern. The discs aren't just cushions. They're also part of the spine's load-bearing structure. They distribute weight across the surface of the vertebrae. They prevent stress from concentrating in one spot. When the discs are compressed normally, they're dense, firm, capable of handling high loads without deforming too much. But when they're swollen, when they're fully hydrated and no longer being squeezed, they become softer, less resistant to deformation, less capable of distributing load evenly. This isn't a problem in weightlessness, because there's no load to distribute. But when gravity returns, when the body suddenly has to bear its own weight again, the discs are unprepared. They're softer than they should be, more compliant, more vulnerable. The first few days back on Earth are critical. The spine has to readjust. The discs have to compress again. Water has to be squeezed out. The nucleus pulposus has to firm up. And during this transition, the risk of disc injury increases. Not dramatically, not to the point where everyone gets hurt, but enough that it's noticeable, enough that astronauts are advised to be careful, to avoid heavy lifting, to give their spines time to adapt. Some astronauts develop disc herniations after returning from space, not immediately, sometimes months later. The disc material, weakened by prolonged swelling, bulges through a weak spot in the annulus fibrosus. It presses on a nerve root. Pain radiates down the leg. Numbness. Tingling. It's not clear whether the herniation is directly caused by spaceflight or whether spaceflight just makes the disc more vulnerable to injury later. Probably some combination. The disc is weakened. Then something happens. Lifting something heavy, twisting awkwardly, and the disc fails in a way it might not have if it hadn't been altered by months of weightlessness. The spine also relies on the muscles around it for support. The erector spinae, the multifidus, the deep stabilizers that run along the vertebrae. These muscles are constantly active when you're upright, helping to hold the spine in alignment, preventing excessive movement. But in weightlessness, these muscles weaken too. just like the anti-gravity muscles in the legs. They lose mass, they lose strength, they become less capable of stabilizing the spine. So when gravity returns, the spine is not only longer and less stable from the swollen discs, but it's also less supported by the muscles around it. The whole system is compromised. Recovery takes time. The discs slowly compress back to their normal size over days to weeks. The muscles slowly regain strength if the person exercises, if they work deliberately to rebuild what was lost. But the spine doesn't forget this experience entirely. Some changes persist. Some astronauts report chronic back pain years after returning from space. Some develop degenerative disc disease earlier than they might have otherwise. The discs, once stretched beyond their normal limits, once subjected to prolonged swelling, might not return completely to their original state. The collagen fibers in the annulus might be permanently loosened. The nucleus pulposus might retain a slightly different composition. The disc might be fractionally more vulnerable to injury for the rest of that person's life. Or maybe not. It's hard to know. The data is limited. The number of people who've spent long periods in space is small. The follow-up studies are incomplete, but the spine remembers, in its own way, in the length it briefly held, in the swelling it experienced, in the pain some felt and others didn't. It remembers that gravity isn't just a force that pulls you down, it's also a force that shapes you, that compresses you slightly, that keeps your discs dense and your spine the length it's meant to be. And without it, the body stretches, not because it wants to, not because it's growing, but because there's nothing pressing it together anymore. Nothing keeping it compact, nothing holding it in the shape it's always known. Your arteries are not rigid tubes carrying blood from place to place. They're living tissue with muscles in their walls that can contract and relax, changing the diameter of the vessel, altering how much blood flows through and how much resistance the heart has to pump against. This happens constantly. Every artery in your body, from the thick aorta leaving your heart down to the smallest arterioles feeding your fingertips, contains a layer of smooth muscle wrapped around its circumference. These muscles respond to signals, chemical signals, hormones in the blood, nitric oxide released by the vessel lining, oxygen levels in the surrounding tissue, mechanical signals, the stretch of the vessel wall as blood pulses through with each heartbeat, the pressure inside the vessel pushing outward, the sheer stress of blood flowing past the inner surface, and neural signals, messages from the autonomic nervous system telling the vessels to constrict or dilate based on what the body needs in that moment. The system is elegant, responsive, constantly adjusting to keep blood pressure stable and blood flow adequate to all your tissues no matter what you're doing. When you stand up from sitting, gravity pulls blood downward into your legs, and for a moment blood pressure in your head drops. But within seconds, the baroreceptors in your neck detect this drop and send signals that cause the arteries in your legs to constrict, reducing how much blood pools there, redirecting it upward. The heart rate increases slightly. Blood pressure stabilizes. You don't faint. This reflex has been operating your entire life. You've stood up thousands of times, tens of thousands of times, and each time the system has compensated without you noticing. The smooth muscle in your arterial walls has learned to respond quickly, has developed the capacity to generate enough force to constrict the vessels when needed, has maintained the sensitivity to detect pressure changes and react appropriately. But all of this earning, all of this calibration has happened in the presence of gravity. In weightlessness, blood no longer pools in the legs when you're upright because there is no upright. There's no gravitational gradient pulling blood downward. The baroreceptors still function, still measure pressure, still send signals, but the pressure patterns they're measuring have changed. On Earth, There's a predictable difference in blood pressure between your head and your feet when you're standing, about 100 millimeters of mercury difference simply due to the weight of the column of blood between them. Your circulatory system has adapted to this gradient. The vessels in your legs have thicker walls, more smooth muscle, greater capacity to withstand high pressure. The vessels in your head are more delicate because the pressure there is lower. Remove gravity, and this gradient disappears. Pressure becomes more uniform throughout the body. The baroreceptors detect this uniformity and interpret it as abnormal, at least initially. They send signals trying to restore the gradient that's always been there. But the signals don't work the way they should, because the problem isn't one the system was designed to solve. Over days, over weeks, the baroreceptors begin to recalibrate. They stop expecting the pressure gradient. They adjust their baseline. They interpret the new uniform pressure as normal. This is adaptation. But there's a cost. The smooth muscle in the arterial walls, no longer receiving the constant signals to constrict in response to gravitational pooling, begins to lose some of its tone, not all of it. The vessels don't become completely slack, but the baseline level of contraction decreases. The muscle becomes less responsive to signals that tell it to tighten. The vessels become slightly more compliant, slightly more willing to expand when pressure increases. This happens gradually. At first, the changes are subtle, measurable only with sensitive instruments. But over months, the difference becomes significant. The arteries lose some of their ability to rapidly constrict when needed. They become slower to respond, less forceful in their contraction, less capable of the quick adjustments that keep blood pressure stable during sudden changes in position or activity. And this doesn't matter in weightlessness. In an environment where blood pressure is relatively uniform and there is no gravitational challenge, the reduced vascular tone is sufficient. Blood flows where it needs to go. The heart pumps adequately. Nothing fails. But when gravity returns, the mismatch reveals itself immediately. An astronaut stands for the first time after months in space, and their blood pressure drops precipitously. The blood rushes into their legs. The baroreceptors detect the drop. They send urgent signals to the arteries to constrict. But the smooth muscle, weakened and deconditioned, can't generate enough force fast enough. The vessels constrict only partially slowly. Blood continues to pool in the lower body. Blood flow to the brain decreases. Vision narrows. Dizziness occurs. If the person doesn't sit down quickly, they may faint. This is orthostatic intolerance, and it's one of the most consistent problems astronauts face upon returning to Earth. Not everyone experiences it to the same degree. Some can stand almost immediately with only mild lightheadedness, while others can't remain upright for more than a few seconds without feeling like they're about to lose consciousness. But almost everyone experiences it to some extent. The severity depends on several factors: how long they were in space, how much cardiovascular exercise they did while there, individual differences in vascular responsiveness, age, genetics, but the underlying cause is the same. The smooth muscle in the arterial walls has lost its conditioning, its ability to rapidly constrict in response to gravitational stress. Recovery takes time. The vessels have to be retrained. Each time the person stands, each time the baroreceptors detect low pressure in the upper body and signal the arteries to constrict, the smooth muscle is working, rebuilding its capacity, regaining its responsiveness. Over days, over weeks, the orthostatic intolerance improves. The vessels relearn how to handle the pressure gradient. The person can stand for longer periods without symptoms, but during the recovery period, standing is difficult. Walking is exhausting. The simple act of being upright requires conscious effort, careful monitoring of symptoms, frequent rest breaks. It's a reminder of how much invisible work the circulatory system does to keep you functional in a gravitational field. There's another layer to this that involves the endothelium, the single layer of cells that lines the inside of every blood vessel. These cells do more than just provide a smooth surface for blood to flow past. They're active participants in regulating vascular function. They produce nitric oxide, a molecule that causes the smooth muscle to relax, dilating the vessel. They produce endothelin, which causes constriction. They sense the shear stress of blood flowing past them and adjust their output of these molecules accordingly. In weightlessness, the patterns of blood flow change. The shear stress on the endothelium becomes more uniform, less variable than it is on Earth, where blood flow changes with position and activity. The endothelial cells respond to this altered shear stress by changing their gene expression, by producing different ratios of vasodilators and vasoconstrictors, by subtly altering their contribution to vascular tone. Some research suggests that prolonged exposure to altered shear stress can lead to endothelial dysfunction, a state where the cells become less capable of producing nitric oxide and more prone to producing inflammatory molecules. This dysfunction can persist even after returning to Earth, potentially increasing long-term cardiovascular risk. The data is still preliminary, the number of people studied is small, but the concern is real. The arteries also undergo structural changes. On Earth, the walls of arteries in the legs are thicker than those in the arms because they have to withstand higher pressure. In weightlessness, where pressure is more uniform, this difference begins to diminish. The arteries in the legs lose some of their wall thickness. The smooth muscle layer thins. The structural reinforcement decreases because it's no longer needed. And when gravity returns, these thinner-walled vessels have to suddenly handle high pressure again. They're less reinforced, less capable of withstanding the stress. There's a theoretical risk of vessel damage, though in practice this seems to be rare. The vessels are resilient. They can handle the acute stress, but they're not optimal for it. They're operating outside their adapted range. All of this, the reduced smooth muscle tone, the endothelial changes, the structural thinning, adds up to a circulatory system that's been quietly altered by the absence of gravity. It still works, it still delivers blood to tissues, but it's been optimized for a different environment, one where pressure is uniform and positional changes don't create challenges. And when that system has to function again in the environment it was originally designed for, there's a period of struggle, of readaptation, of the vessels relearning lessons they once knew instinctively. How hard to squeeze, when to constrict, how quickly to respond. The knowledge isn't lost entirely, it's just dormant, waiting to be reactivated through use, through the repeated challenge of standing, through the constant feedback of baroreceptors signaling that something needs to change. And slowly, with time and effort, the vessels remember. They regain their tone, they restore their responsiveness, they rebuild their capacity to handle the pressure gradient that gravity creates. But the fact that they had to relearn at all is a reminder that these systems, these automatic unconscious processes that keep you upright and functional, are not fixed. They're dynamic. They're shaped by the environment they operate in. And when the environment changes, they change too. Your red blood cells are moving right now. They're traveling through your bloodstream in single file, through the smallest capillaries, squeezing through spaces barely wide enough for them to pass. They are carrying oxygen from your lungs to every tissue in your body. They've been doing this since you were born. Each red blood cell lives for about 120 days. That's roughly 4 months. During that time, it makes thousands of circuits through your body, heart to lungs to tissues and back again, over and over, until the cell membrane begins to break down, until the cell becomes too damaged to function, until it's filtered out by the spleen and destroyed. Your body produces about 2 million new red blood cells every second to replace the ones that are dying. This production happens in your bone marrow, deep inside your bones. Stem cells divide and differentiate into red blood cells, losing their nuclei in the process, filling themselves with hemoglobin, becoming specialized for one purpose, carrying oxygen. The rate of production is carefully controlled. Your body monitors how much oxygen your tissues are receiving. If oxygen levels drop, the kidneys release a hormone called erythropoietin. This hormone travels to the bone marrow and signals it to produce more red blood cells. If oxygen levels are adequate, less erythropoietin is released. Production slows. This feedback loop keeps your red blood cell count stable. Not too many, not too few, just enough to meet your body's needs. But the system was calibrated in gravity. On Earth, when you're standing or sitting upright, gravity pulls blood downward into your legs. Some of that blood pools there. The red blood cells in your leg veins settle slightly, concentrated by gravity into areas of slower flow. Your body has always compensated for this. It produces slightly more red blood cells than it would need if blood were distributed evenly, because some of them are always pulled in the lower body, less available for immediate circulation. In weightlessness, the pulling stops. Blood distributes itself more evenly throughout your body. More red blood cells are circulating actively through your central circulation, through your chest and upper body, through the vessels near your kidneys and heart, and your body notices this. The sensors that monitor oxygen delivery detect that tissues are receiving plenty of oxygen, more than they need perhaps. The kidneys produce less erythropoietin. The bone marrow slows its production of new red blood cells, but the old red blood cells are still there, still circulating, still carrying oxygen, and your body interprets this as excess. Within days of entering weightlessness, red blood cell destruction increases. The spleen, which is responsible for filtering out old or damaged cells, begins working more actively. It removes red blood cells that might have lasted another few weeks on Earth. The cells aren't defective, they are just no longer needed in the quantities that exist. Over the first 2 weeks in space, the total number of red blood cells in your body decreases by about 10 to 15%. This is called space anemia, though it's not anemia in the traditional sense. Your red blood cell count is lower than it was on Earth, but it's appropriate for the environment you're in. You don't feel tired, you don't feel weak. Your tissues are still receiving adequate oxygen because the blood that remains is circulating more efficiently without gravitational pooling. Your blood volume decreases too. Plasma, the liquid component of blood, is filtered out by the kidneys and excreted as urine. The body decides it's carrying too much fluid. It reduces the total volume by about 10%. Smaller blood volume, fewer red blood cells. The circulatory system becomes more compact. This adaptation happens without symptoms. You wouldn't know it was occurring unless someone measured your red blood cell count or your blood volume. You'd feel normal. You'd function normally in the weightless environment, but the changes are real, and they create a problem when gravity returns. When an astronaut comes back to Earth, their body suddenly needs to circulate blood through a gravitational field again. Blood pools in the legs. The amount of blood actively circulating through the upper body decreases. Tissues receive less oxygen than they did in space. But the body's red blood cell count is still low. It's still adapted for weightlessness. There aren't enough red blood cells to adequately supply oxygen to tissues when some of that blood is pooled in the lower body. The result is fatigue, sometimes significant fatigue. The muscles tire more easily. The brain feels foggy. Simple tasks require more effort than they should. It's not dangerous, but it's uncomfortable. And it lasts until the body can rebuild its red blood cell population. The kidneys detect the decreased oxygen delivery. They release more erythropoietin. The bone marrow responds by increasing production. New red blood cells are manufactured and released into the bloodstream. But this takes time. Red blood cells don't mature instantly. It takes several days for a stem cell to fully differentiate into a functional red blood cell, and the body needs millions of them to restore the count to its pre-flight level. Recovery typically takes 2 to 3 weeks. During that time, the astronaut has to be careful not to overexert themselves. Their cardiovascular system is working with reduced capacity. Their blood can't carry as much oxygen as it used to. Activities that were easy before spaceflight are now exhausting. There's another aspect to this. Red blood cells require iron to make hemoglobin. When red blood cells are destroyed, the iron is recycled. The spleen breaks down the cells, releases the iron back into the bloodstream, and that iron is transported to the bone marrow to be used in making new cells. In space, when red blood cell destruction is elevated, there's more iron floating around in the blood than usual. The body has to manage this excess. Some of it gets stored in the liver, some in other tissues. Iron is toxic in high concentrations, so the body carefully regulates where it goes and how much is free in the circulation. When red blood cell production ramps back up after returning to Earth, that stored iron is mobilized. It's transported back to the bone marrow and incorporated into new hemoglobin molecules. This is efficient. The body doesn't need to absorb more iron from food during the recovery period, because it's recycling what it already has. But if an astronaut's iron stores were low before spaceflight, this recycling might not be sufficient. They might become truly anemic during the recovery period, not just space anemic, but deficient in iron as well. This is one reason why nutritional status is carefully monitored before and after spaceflight. There's also evidence that red blood cell shape changes slightly in weightlessness. On Earth, red blood cells are biconcave discs, thinner in the middle than at the edges. This shape maximizes surface area for gas exchange. It also allows the cells to deform easily as they squeeze through narrow capillaries. In space, some studies suggest that red blood cells become slightly more spherical. The biconcave shape is partly maintained by the mechanical stresses of circulation in a gravitational field, by the way blood flows and pools and presses against vessel walls. Without those stresses, the cells relax into a slightly different shape. This change is subtle. It doesn't impair the cell's function in space. They still carry oxygen effectively. But when gravity returns, when the mechanical stresses of Earth-based circulation resume, the cells have to reshape themselves. Most do this without issue, but some may be more fragile, more prone to damage, contributing to the increased destruction that occurs during the readaptation period. The bone marrow itself also changes. In weightlessness, with reduced demand for red blood cell production, the marrow becomes less active. The stem cells are still there, the capacity to produce cells remains, but the machinery isn't running at full capacity, it's idling. When the signal comes to ramp up production after returning to Earth, there's a lag. The marrow has to reactivate fully. It has to recruit more stem cells into the production line. It has to increase the metabolic activity of the cells that are already producing red blood cells. This takes a few days. During that time, the body is struggling to meet its oxygen needs with an inadequate supply of red blood cells. All of this happens quietly. There's no pain, no obvious dysfunction, just a subtle mismatch between the body's oxygen needs and its ability to deliver that oxygen. A fatigue that settles in and doesn't lift for weeks. A reminder that even something as fundamental as red blood cell production is shaped by the environment the body lives in. And when that environment changes, when gravity disappears and then reappears, the body has to adjust. It has to destroy cells it no longer needs and then rebuild them when they're needed again. It has to recalibrate its sensors, its production rates, its understanding of what normal means. The red blood cells themselves don't know any of this. They're simple. They have no nucleus, no ability to make new proteins, no capacity for adaptation beyond their basic function. They just carry oxygen. They circulate, they wear out, they're replaced. But the system that produces them, that monitors them, that decides how many are needed, that system is constantly listening to the environment and responding and changing and trying to match supply with demand in a body that's operating under rules it's never encountered before. There were cells working inside your bones before you knew you had bones, before you were aware of your own body, before thought itself emerged from the developing brain that would one day notice these things. Osteoclasts and osteoblasts, locked in an ancient partnership, building and breaking, creating and dissolving, maintaining the mineral architecture that would eventually hold you upright and let you move through the world. They've been at this work since your skeleton first began to calcify in the womb, and they've never stopped, not for a moment, not even now as you rest here in the quiet. Bone feels permanent when you think about it at all, solid in a way that soft tissues aren't, durable enough to persist long after everything else has decayed, which is why archaeologists find skeletons but rarely find the hearts or lungs or kidneys that once kept those skeletons alive. But bone is not permanent. It's not even static. It's constantly being remodeled, constantly being torn down and rebuilt. A slow renovation that happens throughout your entire life at a pace measured in months and years rather than seconds and minutes, but happening nonetheless, driven by these two populations of cells that have opposing functions and work in careful coordination to maintain the structure you depend on without ever thinking about it. Osteoclasts are the demolition crew. They are large cells, multinucleated, formed when several smaller cells fuse together to create something capable of doing heavy work. They attach themselves to the surface of bone, seal off a small area, and then secrete acid and enzymes into that sealed space, dissolving the mineral matrix and breaking down the collagen fibers that give bone its framework. The dissolved calcium and phosphate are released into the bloodstream, available for use elsewhere in the body, and what remains is a small pit in the bone surface, a resorption cavity that will eventually be filled in by the osteoblasts, but not immediately, not right away, because bone remodeling happens in phases, in a sequence that takes weeks to complete from start to finish. Osteoblasts are the construction crew. They're smaller than osteoclasts, simpler, each one a single cell rather than a fusion of many, and they arrive at the resorption cavity after the osteoclasts have finished their work and moved on. The osteoblasts line up along the cavity and begin secreting collagen, laying down the organic matrix that will eventually mineralize, building layer upon layer in an organized pattern, and then they release calcium and phosphate in controlled amounts, allowing crystals to form within the collagen matrix, hardening it, transforming the soft framework into solid bone again. Some osteoblasts become trapped in the matrix they're creating and transform into osteocytes, the sensing cells you've already learned about, the ones that live in small chambers and monitor mechanical stress. Others finish their work and either die or become lining cells on the bone surface, quiet and inactive until needed again. This cycle has been running since childhood. In youth, the osteoblasts work faster than the osteoclasts, building more bone than is being removed, which is why children grow, why their skeletons increase in size and density as they develop. In adulthood, the two processes reach equilibrium, roughly the same amount of bone being removed as is replaced, maintaining a stable bone mass that fluctuates only slightly over months and years. In old age, the balance tips the other way, with resorption outpacing formation, which is why bone density decreases with age, why fractures become more common, why the skeleton gradually becomes more fragile as the years accumulate. But at any given moment in a healthy adult, the balance holds. For every osteoclast removing bone, there's an osteoblast somewhere building it back. The skeleton maintains itself, except when the signals change. The osteoblasts and osteoclasts don't decide on their own what to do. They respond to signals from the osteocytes, those sensing cells embedded in the bone matrix, and the osteocytes respond to mechanical load, to the deformations and stresses that occur when bone bears weight and experiences force. When mechanical stress is high, the osteocytes signal for more osteoblasts to be recruited, for bone formation to increase, for the skeleton to strengthen in the areas where it's being challenged. When mechanical stress decreases, the signals change and the osteoclasts are favoured, breaking down bone that's no longer needed, freeing up calcium for other uses, reducing the metabolic cost of maintaining tissue that isn't serving a purpose. In weightlessness, mechanical stress drops to nearly zero. The bones no longer bend under load. The osteocytes fall silent, and the balance between osteoclasts and osteoblasts shifts decisively toward resorption. The osteoclasts continue their work at roughly the same rate they always have, moving across the bone surface, creating resorption cavities, dissolving mineral and breaking down matrix. But the osteoblasts slow down. They are recruited less frequently. They produce less collagen, less mineral. The resorption cavities left by the osteoclasts aren't filled in as quickly or as completely as they were before. The bone becomes porous, less dense, its internal structure weakening as more material is removed than replaced. This happens slowly enough that you wouldn't feel it, wouldn't notice any change in how your body functions in the weightless environment where there's no demand for strong bones anyway. But it's measurable. Bone density decreases by about 1% per month in weightlessness. That doesn't sound like much. 1%, barely noticeable in the short term, but over 6 months, that's 6% loss. Over a year, 12%. The numbers accumulate. Calcium leaches out of the skeleton and into the bloodstream at a rate faster than it can be deposited back. The kidneys have to filter this excess calcium, and some of it ends up in the urine, creating a risk for kidney stones, for calcium deposits forming in soft tissues, for the bones to lose not just density but also structural integrity, as the scaffolding that gives them strength is slowly dismantled. The trabecular bone, the spongy interior of bones where the struts and beams are arranged along lines of stress, is affected more than the cortical bone, the dense outer shell. The trabeculae thin, some of them disappear entirely, their material resorbed and not replaced. The network becomes less connected, less capable of distributing load, less resilient to stress. And once a trabecula is gone, once it's been completely resorbed, it doesn't come back, even if mechanical load returns, because the osteoblasts need a scaffold to build on, a surface to attach to, and if the structure is completely removed, there's nothing left for them to work with. This is why astronauts who spend long periods in space can experience bone loss that's only partially reversible. The density can be rebuilt to some extent through exercise and time, but the microarchitecture, the fine internal structure of the bone, may never fully recover. The bones may regain most of their mineral content but remain slightly weaker, slightly more prone to fracture, because the framework has been altered in ways that can't be completely undone, and the calcium that's released into the bloodstream doesn't just disappear, it has to go somewhere. Some of it is excreted by the kidneys, but high levels of calcium in the urine can lead to crystallization, to the formation of kidney stones that can be painful and sometimes dangerous. Some astronauts develop kidney stones during or after spaceflight, and the risk correlates with the amount of bone loss, with the amount of calcium being released from the skeleton. Some of the calcium is taken up by soft tissues, deposited in places it shouldn't be, contributing to vascular calcification, to stiffening of the arteries, to changes in tissue flexibility that may have long-term health consequences. The body tries to manage the excess, tries to excrete it or store it or redistribute it, but there's a limit to how much it can handle, and when calcium is flooding out of the bones month after month, the regulatory systems are overwhelmed. The osteoclasts themselves don't know they're causing a problem. They're just doing what they've always done, responding to the signals they receive, breaking down bone when the osteocytes tell them it's no longer needed. They're efficient, they're effective, they're performing their function exactly as they're supposed to. The issue isn't with the cells themselves, but with the context they're operating in. The absence of the mechanical feedback that would normally tell them to slow down, to let the osteoblasts catch up, to maintain the balance that's been holding steady for years. And when gravity returns, when mechanical load is applied to the bones again, the osteocytes wake up, they sense the stress, they signal for osteoblasts to be recruited, for bone formation to increase. The skeleton begins the slow process of rebuilding, but rebuilding takes longer than breakdown. Bone formation is a gradual process, requiring careful deposition of collagen matrix, mineralization that happens over weeks, hardening that continues for months. The bone can eventually recover much of what it lost, but the recovery is incomplete, imperfect, leaving traces of the time spent without weight, without the constant pressure that shaped the skeleton in the first place. There's something almost quiet about this process, about the way bone dissolves without pain, without inflammation, without any signal that something is being lost. The osteoclasts work in chance, the calcium drifts away, the density decreases, and the body continues functioning normally, because in the environment it's in, strong bones aren't needed. Only when the environment changes, when the body returns to gravity and finds itself vulnerable, does the loss become apparent. The skeleton remembers weight by maintaining the structure weight demands, and when weight is absent, when the demand disappears, the skeleton forgets. Not completely, not entirely, but enough that returning to Earth means relearning how to be strong, how to bear load, how to hold a body upright against a force that never stops pulling downward. There are receptors in your skin right now, millions of them. They're called mechanoreceptors. They detect mechanical force, touch, pressure, stretch, vibration. Some are close to the surface, Meissner's corpuscles, Merkel cells. They respond to light touch, to the brush of fabric against skin, to the sensation of something barely making contact. Others are deeper. Pacinian corpuscles, Ruffini endings. They detect deeper pressure, sustained contact, the stretch of skin when you move or when something presses against you. You've had these receptors since before birth. They developed as your nervous system formed. They've been sending signals to your brain your entire life, telling you where your body ends and the world begins, telling you what's touching you and where, telling you if the touch is gentle or firm or fleeting or sustained. But these receptors don't work in isolation. They've been calibrated by experience, by a lifetime of sensation, by the constant presence of gravity pressing your body against surfaces, pressing clothing against your skin, pressing your internal organs slightly downward inside your torso. Think of it like this. Your skin has been wearing the weight of the world since you were born. Not metaphorically, literally. Gravity presses down on every part of you. Your shoulders carry the weight of your arms. Your torso carries the weight of everything above your waist. Your feet carry the weight of your entire body when you stand. And the mechanoreceptors have learned what this feels like. They've learned to distinguish between the constant background pressure of gravity and the variable pressure of actual touch. They filter out the unchanging weight so you can notice changes, so you can feel when something new makes contact. But in weightlessness, that background pressure vanishes. Your shoulders no longer carry the weight of your arms. Your torso no longer feels the downward press of internal organs. Your feet no longer bear any load at all. The mechanoreceptors suddenly have nothing to filter out. And for some people, this changes how sensation feels. Things that touch you lightly might feel even lighter, almost imperceptible. The receptors that used to detect subtle changes on top of a constant baseline are now detecting those changes against silence. Things that press firmly might feel strange, unfamiliar. The depth of the pressure doesn't match any pattern the receptors have encountered before. Some astronauts report that their sense of touch becomes less precise in space. They reach for objects and misjudge how firmly they're gripping them. They bump into walls and don't register the contact as strongly as they should. They lose track of where their limbs are in space because the proprioceptive feedback, the sense of body position, relies partly on mechanoreceptors in the skin and joints, and those receptors are giving different information now. The soles of your feet are particularly affected. On Earth, they're constantly receiving pressure signals. Every time you stand, every time you walk, the mechanoreceptors in your feet are firing intensely. They're mapping the ground beneath you. They're helping your brain construct a sense of where you are in space and how you're oriented. In weightlessness, the soles of your feet go quiet. They receive almost no input. Some astronauts describe their feet feeling numb after weeks in space. Not truly numb, the nerves still work, the receptors still function, but perceptually numb. The brain stops paying attention to signals from the feet because those signals have become uninformative. The feet aren't touching anything. They aren't bearing weight. They aren't providing useful information about body position. So the brain deprioritizes them. And after months of this, when gravity returns, when the feet suddenly make contact with the ground again and bear the full weight of the body, the sensation is overwhelming. Too much input, too intense. The receptors fire all at once. The brain hasn't processed this much information from the feet in months. Some astronauts say walking feels painful at first, not because anything is damaged, not because the bones or muscles are injured, but because the sensory experience is so intense after such a long silence. It takes days for this to normalize, for the brain to readjust, for the mechanoreceptors to recalibrate to the presence of gravity. There's something else. Deep inside your body, in your joints, there are receptors that detect the angle of each joint, the tension in the ligaments, the pressure in the joint capsule. These receptors contribute to proprioception, your sense of where your body parts are without having to look at them. On Earth, gravity provides constant loading on your joints. Your knees are always bearing some weight when you're upright. Your shoulders are always supporting your arms. The receptors in these joints are always sensing that load. In weightlessness, the loading disappears. The joints no longer experience compression or tension from weight bearing. The receptors still function. They still detect movement. But the baseline sensation changes. Some astronauts report feeling like their arms and legs are floating away from their bodies. Not literally, but perceptually. The sense of connection between limb and torso becomes less certain. They have to rely more on vision to know where their limbs are. They look at their hands more often, check their position visually, rather than trusting the internal sense of where they should be. This isn't complete loss of proprioception, it's just less reliable, less precise, and it affects coordination. Fine motor tasks become slightly harder, not impossible, just requiring more concentration, more visual feedback, more conscious effort. There are also receptors in your internal organs, in your bladder, your stomach, your intestines. These receptors detect stretch and pressure. They tell you when your bladder is full, when your stomach is empty, when your intestines are working to move food through. On Earth, gravity affects how these organs sit inside your torso. The bladder settles slightly lower. The intestines drape in a particular configuration. In weightlessness, everything shifts. The organs float more freely inside the abdominal cavity. They press against different surfaces. They create different patterns of stretch and pressure on the receptors embedded in their walls. Some astronauts report changes in their sense of fullness. They feel full after eating less, or they don't feel full even after eating a normal amount. The signals are different. The brain is trying to interpret them, but the interpretation doesn't match past experience. This usually resolves over time. The brain adapts. It learns the new patterns. It recalibrates what full feels like in this altered context. But there's a period of confusion, of the body not quite knowing what its internal state is, of signals that don't mean what they used to mean. And all of this, the change touch sensation, the uncertain proprioception, the altered internal awareness, adds up to a body that feels slightly foreign to itself. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough. Enough that movements feel less automatic. Enough that the sense of inhabiting your own body becomes slightly more conscious, slightly more effortful. The receptors are still there, still working, still sending signals, but the signals have changed, and the brain, which has spent decades learning what those signals mean in the context of gravity, has to learn a new language. A language where pressure means something different, where touch carries different information, where the body's map of itself has to be redrawn without the constant reference point that gravity provides. And when gravity returns, the map has to be redrawn again. Back to the old configuration, the old patterns, the old meanings. But the redrawing takes time, and until it's complete, the body moves through a world that feels both familiar and strange, known and unknown, home and foreign, all at once. Your eyes are sitting in your skull right now, held in place by muscles and cushioned by fat and surrounded by fluid that protects them from impact. They've been sitting there your whole life, maintaining their shape, focusing light onto the retina, sending signals to your brain that become the images you see. The shape of your eyeball matters. It's not perfectly spherical, but close. The distance from the front of the eye to the back, from the cornea to the retina, determines how light focuses. If the distance is correct, images land crisply on the retina. If it's too long or too short, vision blurs. This distance has been stable for years, maybe decades, but it depends on pressure. The eyeball is filled with fluid, vitreous humour in the back chamber, aqueous humour in the front. These fluids maintain a certain pressure inside the eye called intraocular pressure, and that pressure keeps the eyeball inflated to its proper shape. Outside the eyeball there's more fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the optic nerve, the cable of nerve fibres that connects your eye to your brain. This fluid circulates through the brain and spinal cord, cushioning them, protecting them, and it exerts pressure too. The balance between the pressure inside the eyeball and the pressure outside it around the optic nerve helps maintain the eye's position and shape. On Earth, gravity pulls both fluids downward. Cerebrospinal fluid tends to pool slightly in the lower spine. Blood vessels in the head drain efficiently downward. The pressure around the optic nerve stays relatively low. In weightlessness, fluid redistributes. Blood and cerebrospinal fluid move toward the upper body. The head becomes slightly more fluid-filled. The pressure around the optic nerve increases, and the optic nerve responds to this increased pressure by swelling. Not dramatically, not painfully, just measurably. The optic nerve is a bundle of axons, nerve fibers carrying visual information from the retina to the brain. It exits the back of the eyeball through a small opening in the skull called the optic canal. Normally, there's just enough room for the nerve to pass through comfortably. But when the pressure around the nerve increases, when more fluid accumulates in that space, the nerve swells slightly. It presses against the opening, and the back of the eyeball where the nerve attaches begins to flatten. This flattening changes the shape of the eyeball. Instead of being smoothly curved at the back, it becomes slightly indented where the optic nerve pushes against it. The distance from front to back becomes shorter in that area. The retina, which lines the inside of the eyeball, shifts position, and vision changes. Some astronauts notice their distance vision becoming blurry. Objects far away become harder to focus on. They need reading glasses less often, or not at all. They've become slightly far-sighted, or if they were already nearsighted, they've become less so. This happens gradually. Over weeks, over months, not everyone experiences it, but enough do that it's become a recognized phenomenon. It's called Spaceflight Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, SANS for short. The word syndrome suggests a collection of symptoms, and that's accurate. Different astronauts experience different combinations of changes. Some notice vision changes, some develop swelling of the optic nerve head that can be seen during eye exams. Some show flattening of the back of the eyeball on imaging scans. Some develop folds in the choroid, the layer of blood vessels behind the retina. The common thread is increased pressure, fluid redistribution, the head holding more fluid than it's designed to hold for extended periods. Not everyone is affected equally. Some people seem more susceptible than others. Scientists aren't entirely sure why. It might be anatomical differences, the size of the optic canal, the elasticity of the tissues around the optic nerve, genetic factors that affect how the body regulates pressure. But for those who are affected, the changes can persist. Some astronauts return to Earth and their vision doesn't fully recover. The optic nerve remains slightly swollen. The eyeball retains some of its altered shape. They need different glasses than they did before. Their vision isn't worse exactly, just different, shifted. This is concerning. It suggests that the changes aren't entirely reversible, that the tissues have been permanently altered in some way by the prolonged exposure to increased pressure. There's ongoing research trying to understand the mechanism more fully. Why does the pressure increase so much? Is it purely fluid redistribution, or are there other factors? Does the drainage of cerebrospinal fluid become less efficient in weightlessness? Does the production of the fluid increase? Some studies suggest that the veins draining blood from the head become less efficient without gravity to help pull blood downward. The blood moves more slowly. Pressure in the venous system increases, and this increased venous pressure might contribute to the elevated pressure around the optic nerve. Others suggest that the production of cerebrospinal fluid increases slightly in response to the fluid shift, creating more fluid than the drainage system can handle, leading to a gradual build-up of pressure over time. The truth is probably some combination of factors: multiple systems interacting, multiple pressures accumulating, the body trying to adapt but not quite managing to restore equilibrium. And the eyes, being delicate organs with little room for error, show the effects more obviously than other tissues might. There's also the issue of the retina itself. The retina is the light-sensitive the back of the eye, where photoreceptor cells convert light into electrical signals. It's nourished by blood vessels and by the choroid, that layer of vessels just behind it. When the back of the eyeball flattens, when the shape changes, the retina has to conform to a new contour. It's flexible, but not infinitely so. In some cases, small folds develop in the choroid, and these folds can affect the retina's position and function. Most of the time, these folds don't cause noticeable symptoms. The brain compensates. Vision remains functional, but they're visible on imaging, and they indicate that the tissue has been stressed, that the normal architecture has been disrupted. What's uncertain is whether these changes increase the risk of future eye problems. Will an astronaut who develops SANS be more prone to retinal detachment later in life? To glaucoma? To other vision issues? The data isn't there yet. The number of people who've spent long enough in space to develop significant SANS is still small. The follow-up time is limited. These are questions that will take decades to answer fully. In the meantime, countermeasures are being explored. Devices that create negative pressure on the lower body, pulling fluid back downward, simulating the effect of gravity. Changes in diet or medication that might affect fluid regulation. Exercise protocols designed to promote venous return from the head. Some of these show the promise, some don't seem to help much. It's still experimental. What's clear is that the eyes are sensitive to pressure changes in ways that other organs might not be. The skull is a closed space. There's limited room for expansion. When pressure builds, something has to give, and often what gives is the optic nerve, the weakest point structurally, the place where soft tissue passes through bone, where there's just enough space but not much margin for error. The eyes are windows, people say. Windows to the soul, or windows to the world, depending on the metaphor. But in this case, they're also windows into what happens when the body operates outside the conditions it evolved for. They show the effects of fluid redistribution more visibly than most tissues. They reveal, through blurred vision and swollen nerves, that gravity isn't just a force that holds you to the ground. It's also a force that shapes the pressure gradients inside your body, that keeps fluids distributed in patterns your tissues expect, that maintains the delicate balance between inside and outside, between structure and function. And when that force is removed, when the balance shifts, the eyes remember. They carry the memory in altered shape, in persistent swelling, in vision that's never quite the same as it was before. A reminder that some changes, once made, don't fully unmake themselves. That adaptation has limits, that the body can bend, but not always spring back to exactly where it started. Your eyes are still sitting in your skull, still seeing, still sending signals to your brain. But if they've experienced weightlessness, if they've felt the pressure build and the shape change, they're not quite the same eyes they were. They've been somewhere else, somewhere the body wasn't designed to go, and they've brought something back with them, a slight shift, a small change, a memory written in tissue that can't entirely forget. You have an internal clock running right now, ticking away in a cluster of neurons deep in your brain, behind your eyes, in a structure called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's been keeping time since you were born, maybe even before, cycling through roughly 24-hour periods that govern when you feel alert and when you feel tired, when your body temperature rises and when it falls, when hormones are released and when they're suppressed. This clock doesn't need external input to keep running. It's self-sustaining, generating its own rhythm, but it's constantly being adjusted, entrained by signals from the outside world. Light is the strongest signal, the most powerful synchronizer, hitting photoreceptors in your eyes and sending information directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, telling it whether it's day or night, whether to advance the clock or delay it, whether to release melatonin or suppress it. But light isn't the only signal. There are others, subtler ones, woven into the fabric of daily life on Earth in ways you've never had to notice because they've always been there, consistent and reliable, providing backup cues that help keep your internal clock aligned with the external world. Temperature is one. Your body temperature follows a daily rhythm, lowest in the early morning hours, highest in the late afternoon, and this rhythm both influences and is influenced by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, creating a feedback loop that helps stabilize your circadian timing. Meal times are another. Eating triggers metabolic signals that reach the brain and contribute to the sense of when the day is progressing, when activity should be high, when the body should prepare for rest. Social cues matter too. Interaction with others, noise, activity levels in your environment. All of these provide temporal information that your brain uses to calibrate its sense of time. And then there's gravity, which doesn't seem like it would have anything to do with sleep, but it does in ways that are indirect, difficult to measure, and only become apparent when it's absent. Gravity provides a constant physical reference point for the body's orientation in space, a baseline that affects how your organs settle, how blood distributes, how pressure gradients form throughout your circulatory system, and these physical states contribute to the overall sense of arousal and readiness that the brain uses to determine whether it's time to be active or time to rest. When you lie down at night, gravity helps your body transition into a resting state by changing the distribution of fluids, reducing the work your heart has to do, lowering blood pressure in certain areas while maintaining it in others, creating a constellation of physiological changes that signal to the brain that sleep is appropriate now, that the body has assumed a posture conducive to rest. In weightlessness, this constellation doesn't form the same way. You can close your eyes, you can stop moving, you can assume a position that would be restful on Earth, but your body doesn't experience the same shift in fluid distribution, the same reduction in cardiovascular work, the same pressure changes that normally accompany lying down. The transition from wakefulness to sleep becomes less distinct physiologically, less marked by the clear physical changes that the brain has learned to associate with nighttime. And sleep suffers. Not for everyone, not immediately, but for many astronauts, sleep in space becomes fragmented, harder to initiate, harder to maintain. They fall asleep, then wake after a few hours, then struggle to fall back asleep. Or they sleep lightly, never quite reaching the deep restorative stages that leave you feeling truly rested. Or they wake frequently throughout the night without quite knowing why. Their sleep peppered with brief awakenings that they may not even remember in the morning, but that leave them feeling unrefreshed. Part of this is environmental. Space stations are noisy. There are alarms and ventilation systems and the constant hum of machinery. There are crew members working different shifts, lights are on in other modules. It's hard to create the kind of quiet darkness that promotes good sleep. But part of it is physiological, the body's circadian system struggling to maintain its rhythm without all the usual anchors, drifting slightly from its 24-hour cycle, becoming less synchronized with the artificial day-night schedule that the crew is trying to maintain. The suprachiasmatic nucleus continues to generate rhythms, continues to drive cycles of alertness and sleepiness, but without the reinforcing signals from gravity-dependent physiological changes, without the clear physical transition that happens when you lie down on Earth, the rhythms become less robust, more vulnerable to disruption. The internal clock starts to drift, running slightly longer or slightly shorter than 24 hours, and even though light exposure is being controlled artificially, lights on during work periods, Lights off during rest periods, the drift persists because light alone isn't quite enough to fully entrain the system when other synchronizing signals are absent or altered. Melatonin production is affected too, that hormone released by the pineal gland in response to darkness, the chemical signal that tells your body it's time to sleep. Normally, melatonin levels rise in the evening, peak in the middle of the night, and fall again in the morning. But in space, the timing of melatonin release becomes less predictable, sometimes rising later than it should, sometimes not rising as high, sometimes lingering longer in the morning than it would on Earth. The pineal gland is still functioning, still responding to light and darkness, but the magnitude and timing of the response are altered in ways that scientists are still trying to understand. Possibly because the absence of gravitational influence on blood flow affects how signals reach the gland, possibly because the overall circadian system is less stable and that instability propagates to all the rhythms it controls. Sleep architecture changes as well, the stages of sleep, the progression from light sleep to deep sleep to REM sleep and back again through the night. Astronauts spend less time in slow-wave sleep, the deepest stage, the one associated with physical restoration, with immune function, with the clearing of metabolic waste from the brain. They spend more time in lighter stages, more easily disturbed, less restorative. REM sleep, the stage associated with dreaming, becomes more variable, sometimes occurring at unusual times in the sleep cycle, sometimes with unusual intensity, sometimes feeling more vivid or strange than dreams usually do. Some astronauts report bizarre dreams in space, dreams that feel hyper-real, that involve impossible physics, bodies moving in ways they shouldn't, spaces that don't make sense, and while dreams are always strange to some degree, there's a quality to space dreams that many describe as distinctly different, as if the brain is trying to process the sensory experiences of weightlessness and can't quite integrate them into the usual dream logic. The vestibular system, confused by the absence of gravity, sends signals that don't match any waking experience, and these signals bleed into sleep, into dreams, creating scenarios where the dreamer is falling but never landing, floating but with no sense of up or down, moving through environments that shift and rotate in disorienting ways. And then there's the issue of sleep pressure, the biological drive to sleep that builds up the longer you're awake, that accumulates throughout the day and is discharged during sleep. On Earth, this pressure follows a predictable pattern, influenced by how long it's been since you last slept, how much physical and mental activity you've engaged in, how much adenosine has built up in your brain signaling that neurons need rest. But in space, the pattern becomes less clear. Physical activity is different. Muscles aren't working against gravity. Exertion doesn't feel the same. The body doesn't accumulate fatigue in quite the same way. Mental activity might be higher due to the demands of the mission, the novelty of the environment, the constant vigilance required to operate safely in such an unforgiving place. But that mental fatigue doesn't always translate into the kind of sleep pressure that leads to restful sleep. So astronauts lie in their sleeping bags tethered to the wall so they don't float around the cabin, wearing sleep masks to block out the light, earplugs to muffle the noise, and they wait for sleep to come, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, and when it does it's often lighter, briefer, less satisfying than the sleep they were accustomed to on Earth. Medications help some, sleeping pills, melatonin supplements, drugs that increase sleep pressure or reduce arousal. Many astronauts use them regularly, though not without concern, because any medication that affects the brain carries risks, especially in an environment where alertness might be critical at any moment, where an emergency could require immediate response, where grogginess could be dangerous. And even with medication, sleep remains imperfect. The body is trying to rest in conditions it wasn't designed for, trying to follow a circadian rhythm without all the usual anchors, trying to transition into sleep without the gravitational cues that have always marked the boundary between wakefulness and rest. Over months, chronic sleep deprivation accumulates. Not severe deprivation, not the kind that causes hallucinations or complete dysfunction, but enough to affect mood, cognitive performance, reaction time, decision-making, enough to make missions harder than they need to be, to reduce the crew's effectiveness, to increase the risk of errors. And when astronauts return to Earth, when they lie down in a real bed and feel their body press into the mattress, feel the familiar weight of blankets, feel the fluid redistribution that signals to their brain that rest is appropriate now. Sleep often comes more easily, but not immediately, not perfectly, because the circadian system has been disrupted for months and needs time to re-entrain, to re-establish its rhythms, to remember the patterns it used to follow so automatically. For some, sleep normalizes within days. For others, it takes weeks. The internal clock finds its footing again, synchronizes with the external world, rebuilds its connection to all the subtle cues that keep it running on time. The body remembers how to rest, how to transition fully into sleep, how to cycle through the stages in the right order and for the right duration. But the sleep in space, fragmented and light and strange, remains in memory, not as something traumatic, not as something that broke the body, but as something that revealed how much sleep depends on context, on the physical state of being held to the ground, on the rhythms that gravity helps maintain without ever announcing itself as part of the system. Sleep needs stillness, needs the body to settle, needs gravity to remind it that night has truly come and it's safe now to let go completely, to drift downward into unconsciousness, to rest in a way that only happens when the world is holding you steady and pulling you gently toward the ground. Your immune system is moving right now, patrolling through vessels and tissues, searching for threats that might not even exist but could appear at any moment. And this surveillance has been continuous since your immune system first developed. Since the cells that would become your defense network first learned to distinguish self from non-self, foreign from familiar. White blood cells drift through your bloodstream, squeeze through capillary walls into tissues, crawl along the surfaces of organs looking for signs of infection or damage. And when they find something that shouldn't be there, a bacterium, a virus, a damaged cell that needs to be cleared away, they respond with remarkable precision, attacking the threat, signaling for backup, coordinating a defense that usually resolves the problem before you're even aware there was one. But this system depends on movement, on the ability of immune cells to travel from where they're produced to where they're needed. And that movement happens through two interconnected networks, the blood vessels you're already familiar with, and the lymphatic system, a parallel network of vessels that carries lymph, a clear fluid similar to blood plasma, through the HOI, collecting debris and pathogens and transporting them to lymph nodes where immune cells can examine them and mount responses if necessary. The lymphatic system has no pump like the heart, no central force driving fluid forward, so it relies on other mechanisms to move lymph along. The contraction of skeletal muscles that squeeze the vessels, the pulsation of nearby arteries that creates pressure waves, the opening and closing of one-way valves that prevent backflow, and the constant pull of gravity that helps drain lymph from the upper body downward toward the larger vessels that eventually return it to the bloodstream. On Earth, this system works efficiently, moving lymph steadily through the body, filtering it through lymph nodes, returning it to circulation in a cycle that completes itself several times a day. But in weightlessness, the mechanisms that drive lymph flow are disrupted in ways that cascade through the entire immune system, altering how quickly immune cells can reach sites of infection, how effectively they can be filtered and activated in lymph nodes, how well the body can mount a coordinated defense against pathogens that might enter through a cut or a breath or contact with a contaminated surface. Without gravity pulling lymph downward, the fluid moves more slowly, pools in unexpected places, creates regions of stagnation where immune cells accumulate but aren't being transported efficiently toward lymph nodes for processing. The lymph nodes themselves, those small bean-shaped structures scattered throughout the body where immune cells gather and communicate, receive less consistent flow, fewer signals about what's happening in distant tissues, less opportunity to activate and deploy the specialized cells needed to fight specific threats. The entire surveillance network becomes sluggish, less responsive, operating with a delay that wouldn't matter in most situations, but could become critical if an infection takes hold before the immune system fully mobilizes. White blood cells themselves are affected by the altered circulation patterns, not just in the lymphatic system, but in the bloodstream as well. Neutrophils, the most abundant type of white blood cell, normally migrate towards sites of infection by following chemical gradients, sensing molecules released by damaged tissues or invading pathogens and moving upstream toward higher concentrations, a process called chemotaxis that requires the cells to crawl along blood vessel walls, squeeze between endothelial cells, and navigate through tissue spaces to reach their target. But chemotaxis is influenced by fluid flow, by the mechanical environment the cells are moving through, and in weightlessness those conditions change in ways that make navigation more difficult, gradients less clear, the path from bloodstream to infection site less direct. Studies of astronauts' immune function show mixed results, some aspects appearing normal, others clearly altered. The picture complicated by the fact that spaceflight involves multiple stressors: radiation exposure, psychological stress, altered sleep, confined living conditions, all of which affect immune function independently of gravity's absence, making it hard to isolate which changes are due specifically to weightlessness, and which are due to the broader context of living in space. But certain patterns emerge consistently: delayed wound healing, suggesting that the immune cells responsible for clearing debris and coordinating tissue repair aren't arriving at wounds as quickly or working as effectively once they get there. Reactivation of latent viruses like herpes simplex and varicella zoster, indicating that the surveillance mechanisms that normally keep these dormant infections suppressed are less vigilant in space. Altered cytokine production, with some inflammatory signals being produced in excess, while others are diminished, creating an imbalanced immune response that might overreact to minor stimuli while underreacting to genuine threats. The bone marrow, where most immune cells are produced, undergoes changes similar to those affecting red blood cell production: reduced activity, decreased output, a scaling back of production in response to signals that the body doesn't need as many new cells as it's been making. This makes sense from the body's perspective, conserving resources when demand seems lower, but it leaves the immune system with fewer fresh recruits, fewer cells capable of responding to new challenges, a reserve that's been drawn down just when the environment, cramped quarters, recycled air, surfaces that can't be cleaned as thoroughly as they would be on Earth, might actually pose greater infection risks than normal life. Lymphocytes, the white blood cells responsible for adaptive immunity, for remembering past infections and mounting faster, stronger responses when the same pathogen appears again, show altered patterns of activation and proliferation in space. T cells, which coordinate immune responses and directly kill infected cells, become less effective at both tasks. Their signaling pathways disrupted by the altered mechanical environment, their ability to form stable contacts with target cells reduced when the usual gravitational forces that help bring cells together are absent. B cells, which produce antibodies, continue functioning, but may produce antibodies with slightly altered specificity or effectiveness. The fine-tuning of the immune response becoming less precise when the cells that normally regulate antibody production are themselves affected by the changed conditions. There's also evidence that the immune system's ability to distinguish self from non-self becomes slightly less reliable in space, with some astronauts showing increased markers of autoimmunity antibodies directed against the body's own tissues, inflammation that targets normal cells rather than foreign invaders. This doesn't progress to full autoimmune disease during typical mission lengths, but it suggests the system's calibration is off, its ability to maintain tolerance for the body's own components strained by operating in conditions where the usual physical cues and mechanical signals aren't present to help guide cell behavior and maintain proper regulation. The gut, where a large fraction of the body's immune cells reside, and where constant interaction with trillions of bacteria requires a delicate balance between tolerance and defense, experiences its own disruptions in weightlessness. The microbiome shifts, certain bacterial species becoming more or less abundant. The balance between different microbial communities changing in ways that affect how the gut's immune cells respond to the bacteria that are supposed to be there, potentially leading to increased inflammation, altered nutrient absorption, changes in the signals that gut immune cells send to the rest of the body about what's happening in the digestive tract. And while the immune system continues to function, continues to fight infections when they occur, continues to clear damaged cells and maintain basic defense capabilities, it's working at a disadvantage, operating with altered circulation, reduced lymph flow, changed cell production, disrupted signaling pathways, all the small inefficiencies adding up to a system that's still effective enough for most purposes, but not as robust as it was on Earth, not as quick to respond, not as coordinated in its actions. When astronauts return to Earth, when circulation patterns normalize and lymph begins flowing properly again and the mechanical environment returns to something their immune cells evolved to operate in, the system gradually recovers, rebuilding its reserves, restoring its responsiveness, re-establishing the coordination between different cell types and tissues that allows for effective defense. But the recovery isn't immediate, and during the transition period there's vulnerability, a window where immune function is still compromised even as the body returns to an environment with its usual pathogen exposures, its usual infection risks, requiring astronauts to be cautious, to avoid unnecessary exposures, to give their immune systems time to readjust before resuming normal activities that might challenge defenses that aren't yet fully restored. The immune system, like so many other systems, adapted itself over evolutionary time to work within certain physical constraints, certain patterns of flow and pressure and cell movement that gravity makes possible, and when those constraints are removed, when the physical context changes, the system continues operating but not optimally, not with the full effectiveness it's capable of when all the conditions it expects are present. It's still protecting you, still watching for threats, still responding when challenges arise, but doing so with one hand tied, working harder to achieve results that used to come more easily, and carrying the knowledge, written into its patterns of altered gene expression and changed cell populations, that the body has been somewhere it wasn't meant to go, somewhere the ancient mechanisms of defense struggle to fully adapt to, somewhere that asks more of the immune system than gravity ever did. Life began in water, billions of years ago. Single cells, simple organisms drifting in ancient oceans where gravity's pull was softened by buoyancy. But even there, gravity existed. It pulled denser particles downward. It created pressure gradients in the water column. It influenced how cells settled, how they moved, how they organized themselves in space. As life evolved, as organisms grew more complex, gravity became a more explicit constraint. The first cells that ventured onto land had to contend with it directly. No water to provide buoyancy anymore, just air, and the full weight of the body pressing against the ground. Plants developed rigid structures, cell walls reinforced with cellulose, vascular systems to move water upward against gravity's pull. Animals developed skeletons, internal frameworks that could bear weight. muscles that could work against the constant downward force. Every adaptation, every innovation, every structure that allowed life to exist on land was shaped by the need to function in a gravitational field. And over hundreds of millions of years, the design became refined. Bones arranged to distribute load efficiently, muscles positioned to generate force where it was needed, circulatory systems capable of moving fluid upward, nervous systems that could coordinate movement in three-dimensional space while always accounting for the pull downward. Your body is the result of this refinement. Every system in you has been optimized for life on Earth, for standing upright, for walking, for moving through a world that resists you constantly. Not just your bones and muscles, everything. Your inner ear, calibrated to detect changes in position relative to gravity. Your blood vessels, structured to handle pressure gradients created by gravity. Your cells, with cytoskeletons and internal organization influenced by the constant mechanical stress of being pulled in one direction. Even your DNA, coiled and packaged in ways that respond to mechanical forces that change gene expression based on tension and compression. Gravity isn't just something your body tolerates. It's something your body was built around. And there was never any evolutionary pressure to function without it, because it was always there, every ancestor you've ever had, going back to the first organisms that crawled out of the ocean, experienced gravity every moment of their lives. Every generation, every individual, every cell in every body that ever contributed to the genetic lineage that eventually became you. Gravity was the one constant that never changed. Not like climate, which shifted from ice ages to warm periods and back again. Not like oxygen levels, which fluctuated over geological time as plant life expanded and contracted. Not like food availability, which varied with seasons and migrations and the success or failure of the ecosystem. Gravity stayed the same, 9.8 meters per second squared, always pulling downward, always present. So there was no reason for evolution to prepare for its absence. No organism ever survived long enough without gravity to pass on adaptations that might help, because no organism ever encountered that condition until humans went to space. This is why your body struggles in weightlessness. Not because it's fragile, not because it's poorly designed, but because it's designed for something else entirely. For Earth, for ground beneath your feet, for a force that never stops pulling you downward. Take away that force and the body does its best. It adapts where it can, it compensates. It finds ways to function in the altered environment. But it's improvising. It's using systems that were optimized for one set of conditions and trying to make them work in another. And some things adapt well. Some things manage, but some things don't. Some systems lose function that can't be easily recovered. Some changes persist even after gravity returns. Some adaptations come at a cost that only becomes apparent later, because evolution is slow. It works over thousands of generations, millions of years, slowly selecting for traits that improve survival and reproduction in the environment organisms actually live in. Humans have been going to space for less than a century, a handful of generations, a blink in evolutionary time. There's been no opportunity for natural selection to favor traits that help in weightlessness. No genetic variants that protect bone density without gravity. No mutations that maintain muscle mass without load. No adaptations that keep the cardiovascular system calibrated without a pressure gradient. Maybe if humans spent thousands of years living in space, if enough generations passed with selection pressure favoring those who adapted better, evolution might begin to produce bodies more suited for weightlessness. But that hasn't happened, and it won't happen in your lifetime, or your children's, or theirs. The body you have is the body that evolution gave you for Earth. And when you take it to space, you're asking it to operate outside its design parameters. It's like running software on hardware it wasn't written for. It might work partially, but there will be glitches, errors, functions that don't execute correctly, not because the software is bad, but because the platform is wrong. Your body is trying, is doing everything it can to maintain function in weightlessness. Cells are signaling. Genes are being expressed. Proteins are being produced. Systems are attempting to compensate, but the compensations are imperfect because the body doesn't know what weightlessness is. It has no evolutionary memory of this condition, no stored solutions from past generations who survived it. It's encountering something completely novel, and so it responds the only way it can, by interpreting the absence of gravity as a signal that certain functions are no longer needed. Bones aren't bearing load. They must not need to be as strong. Reduced density, muscles aren't working against resistance. They must not need to be as powerful, reduce mass. Blood isn't pooling in the legs. There must be too much of it. Reduce volume. These responses make sense from the body's perspective. They're logical, they're efficient, but they're based on assumptions that were true for millions of years and suddenly aren't anymore. And so the body adapts in ways that help in space but hurt when gravity returns. This is the fundamental challenge. The body isn't broken by weightlessness. It's just optimized for the wrong environment. And re-optimizing takes time, effort, deliberate intervention. You can't expect evolution to have prepared for this. Evolution only prepares for conditions that exist long enough to select for survival. And gravity's absence is too new, too rare, too far outside the range of experiences that shape the human body over millions of years. So when you float in space, when your bones thin and your muscles weaken and your blood volume decreases, remember, this isn't failure. This is a body doing exactly what it was designed to do, adapting to the environment it's in, conserving resources where they seem unnecessary, responding to signals that have always been reliable guides. It's just that the signals are wrong now. The environment has changed in a way no ancestor ever experienced. And the body, brilliant as it is, flexible as it is, capable as it is, doesn't have the evolutionary toolkit to handle this gracefully. It can only do its best, and wait, and hope that gravity returns before the changes become irreversible. Because gravity will return for most who leave Earth. And when it does, the body will begin the long process of remembering what it once knew instinctively. How to stand, how to bear weight, how to function in the world that made it, the world it was always meant for. There's a weight to being human that you've carried your entire life without noticing it, a constant press of the world against your body against the world, and in that press every system you have has found its equilibrium, its way of functioning within the constraints that gravity provides. You've never had to think about this because thinking wasn't required, because the body learned long before consciousness what it needed to do to exist in a world that never stops pulling everything downward, and it built itself accordingly, cell by cell, tissue by tissue, system by system, into something capable of standing and walking and moving through space that resists every motion. And all of this happened automatically, guided by signals you never felt and processes you never directed, and an intelligence distributed throughout your body that knows how to maintain itself when the conditions are right. But the conditions were always right, until they weren't. Until humans went to space and discovered that the body, remarkable as it is, doesn't know what to do when the one constant it's always relied on suddenly disappears, when the pull that shaped every adaptation over millions of years is no longer there to provide the mechanical feedback that keeps bones dense and muscles strong and blood flowing in the patterns that deliver oxygen efficiently and balance intact and sleep regulated and immune cells moving where they need to go. The body doesn't fail in weightlessness. But it change it, adapting to the new environment the only way it knows how, by conserving resources that seem unnecessary and reducing functions that appear redundant, and allowing structures to simplify when the load that justified their complexity is no longer present. And these changes happen quietly. Your bones lose density without pain. Your muscles lose mass without soreness. Your blood volume decreases without symptoms. Your cardiovascular system recalibrates without distress. Everything adjusts, everything adapts, and you function well enough in the weightless environment that you might not realize how much has changed until gravity returns and the body suddenly has to remember everything it temporarily forgot, has to rebuild what it dismantled, has to restore the strength and capacity and coordination that it let slip away because they seemed unnecessary in a world without weight. The return to Earth is when the dependency becomes obvious, when the body's reliance on gravity reveals itself through weakness and fatigue and dizziness and pain, through the struggle to stand without fainting and walk without trembling and lift objects that used to feel light, through the realization that the body you took to space is not quite the same body you've brought back, that something essential has been lost or at least diminished, something that will take time and effort to regain. Standing becomes work. Walking becomes exhausting. The simple act of existing in a gravitational field requires energy you didn't know you were spending all along, energy the body in space stopped producing because it didn't seem necessary anymore. But the body relearns. It remembers slowly through repeated exposure to the conditions it was designed for, through the constant mechanical stress of bearing weight and the pressure gradients that form when blood pulls in the legs, and the compression that happens in the spine, and the loading that stimulates bones to rebuild, and the resistance that tells muscles they're needed again. The osteoblasts start working faster. The cardiovascular system restores its responsiveness. The muscles regain their mass. The vestibular system recalibrates. The red blood cell count climbs back toward normal. Week by week, the body returns to something close to what it was before, though perhaps not entirely. Perhaps with traces of the experience written into tissues that adapted and readapted and now carry the memory of both states, the body with gravity and the body without. And in that memory is a reminder of how much you depend on the pull downward. How much of your body's function is predicated on the assumption that weight will always be there, that the ground will always push back against your feet, that fluids will always settle according to a gradient you never have to think about. You've lived your entire life in partnership with gravity, and the partnership has been so seamless, so automatic, so completely integrated into every aspect of your existence that you've never noticed it. Never had to acknowledge the role gravity plays in keeping you functional and healthy and capable of moving through the world with the ease you've always taken for granted. The body isn't fragile, it's resilient, it's adaptable. It can survive and function in conditions far outside the range it evolved for. But it has limits, and those limits reveal themselves not through catastrophic failure but through gradual decline, through the slow accumulation of small deficits that add up to significant impairment when the body is finally asked to perform tasks it used to handle effortlessly. The body in space is doing the best it can with the information it has, with the signals it's receiving, with the environment it finds itself in. It's not broken, it's not damaged, it's just optimized for something else, for a world it's temporarily left behind, for conditions it will eventually return to. And when it does return, when gravity reasserts itself and the familiar weight comes back and the body feels the ground beneath it again, there's a sense of coming home, not emotionally, but physiologically, as if every cell recognizes the environment it was meant for and begins the work of restoration with something like relief. The bones start rebuilding, the muscles start strengthening, the heart starts working harder, the spine compresses back to its normal length, the balance returns, sleep improves, the immune system regains its coordination. Everything that changed begins changing back. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough that eventually the body functions the way it used to, the way it's supposed to, the way millions of years of evolution prepared it to function in the only environment life on Earth has ever known. Gravity doesn't care about you. It doesn't notice you. It's just a fundamental property of mass warping space-time, an impersonal force that affects everything equally. But your body cares about gravity, depends on it, needs it to maintain the structures and functions that keep you alive and capable in yourself. And in recognizing that dependency, in understanding how much the pull downward shapes every aspect of your physiology, you can appreciate the quiet partnership you've always had with the force that holds you to the earth, the force that's been there every moment of your life, pulling gently, constantly, invisibly, making it possible for you to exist in the form you do. And now, as this journey through the body without weight comes to a close, as you rest here in the quiet with these thoughts settling like the bones and muscles and blood that gravity shapes, I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with me through these long hours, through all these chapters exploring what happens when the body leaves the only home it's ever known. If this video brought you calm, if it helped you rest, if it gave you something to think about as you drifted towards sleep, I'd be grateful if you'd press the like button. It helps others find these videos when they need them. And if you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing to The Sleepy Biologist. There are more journeys to take, more systems to explore, more quiet biology waiting to be discovered. To the members of this channel, your support makes this work possible, and I'm deeply grateful. If you'd like to join them, memberships are available, and every super thanks, every contribution, helps me continue making these long-form videos for anyone who needs them. Leave a comment if you'd like about where you're listening from, what you'd like to hear about next, or just to say you were here. I read them all, and it means more than you might think to know you're out there, resting, listening, letting biology become a bridge between wakefulness and sleep. Thank you for being here. Thank you for letting me walk beside you through this exploration of what the body does when gravity disappears and then returns. May your rest be deep, may your dreams be gentle, and may you wake feeling restored, ready to stand again in the world that's always held you, the world that's always pulled you home. Good night.